Fleeing for her life, she hid on a stranger's carriage, not knowing he was a duke who would keep her safe. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining us from, and subscribe if you love romantic stories like this. Now, let's fall into this tale together. London, April 1824. Rain fell over Bloomsbury that night, cold, relentless, the kind of rain that soaked through wool and bone alike. Beatrice Langford ran through the dark streets as though the devil himself chased at her heels. Perhaps he did. Her feet were bare, the delicate evening slippers long lost somewhere between Cordelia's townhouse and this godforsaken maze of alleys. The cobblestones beneath her were slick with rain and filth she didn't want to think about. Each step sent jolts of pain shooting through her soles, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Behind her, men's voices cut through the drumming rain, sharp, commanding, drawing closer with every passing second. She can't have gone far. Check the side streets. Now, Beatrice's lungs burned. Her legs trembled with exhaustion that went bone deep. The pale blue muslin gown, the one Cordelia had insisted she wear to dinner, as though everything were perfectly normal, clung to her body like a sodden shroud, the wet fabric tangling around her knees with every stride. Her hands throbbed. She'd wrapped them hastily in torn strips from her petticoat, but blood still seeped through the makeshift bandages, mixing with rainwater and dripping onto the stones below. The bedroom window had shattered beautifully under the brass candlestick. The climb down the rain-slicked trellis had been less graceful, but she was out, and she would die before going back. Tomorrow morning, Cordelia's voice echoed in her mind, honey sweet and utterly venomous. The physicians will come for you, darling. A rest at a proper institution will do wonders for your instability. Instability. The word men used when women refused to behave. Beatrice turned left, then right, her sense of direction failing in the labyrinth of rain-drenched streets. She needed to reach somewhere public. Hyde Park, Mayfair, anywhere with witnesses, anywhere Cordelia's hired hunters couldn't simply drag her back like a piece of lost property. She rounded another corner and nearly collapsed against a lamppost. Her body had reached its limit. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. The world tilted sideways, and for one terrifying moment, she thought she might actually faint right there in the middle of the street, where Cordelia's men would find her unconscious and helpless. And then she saw it. A carriage. Not just any carriage. An elegant black lacquered vehicle with gold trim, pulled by a matched pair of grey horses. The kind of carriage that screamed wealth and power. The kind that belonged to someone with a title, someone with influence. It stood motionless at the side of the street, while two stablemen worked to replace a lame horse. The coachman stood beneath a nearby awning, smoking a pipe and watching the work with the infinite patience of a man who'd performed this task 1,000 times. The carriage door hung slightly ajar. Beatrice didn't think. Thinking was a luxury she could no longer afford. She staggered toward the vehicle on trembling legs, gripped the rain-slick iron step with her damaged hands, and knocked on the window, hard. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the velvet curtain shifted. A face appeared in the lamplight. Male, perhaps 30, though it was difficult to tell in the shadows. Dark hair, slightly disheveled as though he'd been running his hands through it. Strong jaw dusted with the shadow of evening stubble. Eyes the color of aged whiskey, sharp and assessing as they took her in, and an expression of profound irritation. The window lowered an inch. What the devil? Ugh, please. The word tore from Beatrice's throat, raw and desperate. She knew she should be more articulate, more composed, but fear had stripped away every pretense. Please, sir, I need help. They're coming. I have nowhere else to go. Please. The man blinked, clearly taken aback by her appearance and her plea. His gaze traveled over her slowly, really looked at her. Soaked brown hair plastered to her skull and shoulders. Ruined evening gown streaked with mud. Bare, bleeding feet. Hands wrapped in blood-stained cloth that had once been fine white linen. Beatrice watched his face, trying to read whether he would help or slam the window shut and call for the constable. For one terrible second, she thought he would refuse. And then, from somewhere behind her, the voices grew suddenly, horrifyingly louder. There, that way. Did you see a woman? Brown hair? Blue dress? Beatrice's heart stopped. She turned instinctively, preparing to run again even though her legs had nothing left to give. Even though she knew, with sick certainty, that she wouldn't make it another street. The carriage door flew open. A hand shot out and caught her wrist, not roughly but with absolute certainty. "Get in," the man said, his voice low and commanding. "Quickly." Beatrice didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled up the step and tumbled into the carriage with all the grace of a drowning woman grabbing a lifeline. The man pulled her inside and slammed the door shut behind her. He rapped twice on the ceiling with his knuckles, sharp, decisive. "Jenkins, drive." "Now, but your grace," came a muffled voice from above. "The horse isn't fully—" "I said drive." The authority in that voice was absolute. The carriage lurched into immediate motion. Outside, Beatrice heard raised voices. "Wait! Stop that carriage!" But the vehicle was already moving, wheels clattering over wet stone, pulling steadily away from Cordelia's hunters and into the rain-blurred darkness of London's streets. Beatrice collapsed onto the leather bench seat, gasping for air like a landed fish. Her whole body shook, from cold, from terror, from the sheer overwhelming relief of escape. Silence filled the carriage interior, only the sound of rain drumming steadily on the roof, the creak of wood and leather as the vehicle swayed, the ragged sound of her own breathing gradually slowing to something approaching normal. And across from her, sitting with perfect composure on the opposite bench, the man who had just saved her life watched her with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He didn't look afraid, didn't look particularly concerned. He looked calculating, assessing, like a man examining an unexpected problem and deciding whether it was worth solving. Beatrice forced herself to sit up straighter, despite every muscle screaming in protest. She pushed the wet hair from her face with trembling hands, acutely aware of how she must look, how inappropriate this entire situation was. "Thank you," she managed, when she'd caught enough breath to form words. Her voice came out hoarse but sincere. I'm so sorry for the intrusion. I had nowhere else to turn. Thank you for not handing you over to those men." The man's voice was deep, controlled. "Don't I make it a policy not to hand terrified women over to unknown pursuers without at least understanding the situation first?" He leaned back slightly, studying her with an intensity that made Beatrice want to look away. But she didn't. She met his gaze as steadily as she could manage. "Who were they?" he asked. "Men hired by my stepmother." One dark eyebrow rose fractionally. "Your stepmother sent armed men after you?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Beatrice swallowed hard. This was the moment. She could lie, spin some story that sounded more respectable, less desperate, but something about this man, about the way he looked at her with those sharp, intelligent eyes, told her he would know. He would see through any fabrication she attempted, so she told him the truth. "My real mother died when I was 12, she said, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "Scarlet fever. My father remarried 3 years later. Cordelia." The name tasted bitter. "She seemed kind enough at first, devoted, the perfect stepmother." Beatrice paused, gathering her courage to continue. 6 months ago, my father died. A sudden fever. He was healthy 1 week, gone the next, and 2 weeks ago I discovered that Cordelia had forged his will." The man's expression didn't change, but something sharpened in those whiskey-colored eyes. A sudden, focused attention. "Forged," he repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "Completely," Beatrice confirmed. "His signature, his seal, the witness marks, all of it false. She stole everything, every pound, every property my father spent his life building, all of it now legally hers through documents he never actually signed. And when you confronted her about this theft," Beatrice's hands clenched in her lap, sending fresh pain through her cut palms, "she said I was hysterical, unstable, overcome with grief and clearly not in my right mind." Her voice dropped. "She said I needed care." The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. An asylum. It wasn't a question. He understood immediately what that meant. "Tomorrow morning," Beatrice continued, forcing the words out, "physicians were scheduled to arrive. Very well-paid physicians who would sign whatever papers Cordelia put in front of them without asking inconvenient questions. And then I would simply disappear, locked away in some country institution where no one would ever hear my accusations against her." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Outside the carriage, rain-blurred London passed by in streaks of lamplight and shadow. The vehicle swayed gently as it navigated the uneven streets, moving steadily north, away from Bloomsbury, away from Cordelia's townhouse, away from everything Beatrice had ever known. The man leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, and when he spoke his voice was quieter, more serious. "Your name," he said to Beatrice. "Beatrice Langford." She hesitated, then asked, "And you are—" He extended his hand formally, as though they were being introduced at a perfectly civilized dinner party, instead of sitting in a moving carriage while she fled for her life. "Arthur Silverton," he said. "Duke of Silverton." Beatrice's breath caught. Duke. She'd suspected as much from the carriage and the way the coachman had addressed him, but hearing it confirmed made everything feel suddenly more impossible, more inappropriate. She took his offered hand carefully, mindful of her bandaged palms. His grip was firm but gentle. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, making sure to use the proper form of address. Despite everything, despite the desperation that had driven her to his carriage door, she still knew how to show respect to a man who'd just saved her life. "I cannot possibly express how grateful I am for your assistance." Arthur inclined his head slightly. "You needn't be quite so formal under the circumstances, Miss Langford, though I appreciate the courtesy." "Courtesy costs nothing, Your Grace," Beatrice said, "and you've given me far more than that." Something flickered in Arthur's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. He settled back against his seat, still studying her with that unsettling intensity. "You have no other family?" he asked. "No one who could challenge this forged will? No one who might offer you protection?" "I have an aunt," Beatrice admitted. "My mother's sister. She emigrated to America 15 years ago. Boston." Her smile was bleak. An ocean away and utterly unreachable without funds for passage, funds which Cordelia has ensured I no longer possess. Arthur nodded slowly, processing this information with careful attention. "I see." More silence. The carriage rolled steadily onward, leaving London behind with each turn of the wheels. Beatrice became suddenly acutely aware of how she must look, soaked to the skin, bedraggled, bleeding, sitting in an obviously expensive carriage across from a duke, while completely unchaperoned and utterly compromised. Her situation had gone from desperate to potentially scandalous in the span of minutes. "Your Grace," she said quietly, unable to meet his eyes any longer. I don't expect anything from you. If you could simply let me out somewhere safe, somewhere public, I'll find my way from there." "To where, exactly?" The question was calm, almost clinical in its directness. Beatrice opened her mouth, closed it again. She had no answer, no plan beyond escape. "I don't know," she finally admitted, hating how small and defeated she sounded. "Do you have money?" "No, Your Grace." "Connections? Friends who might offer shelter?" "None that Cordelia hasn't already turned against me. She's been very thorough in her campaign to paint me as unstable. By now, everyone in our social circle believes I'm dangerously deranged and that my confinement was a tragic necessity." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. Then he leaned forward slightly, and something in his demeanor changed, not quite softening but becoming less distant, more present. "Miss Langford," he said, "Van, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Of course, Your Grace. Are you telling me the truth about all of this, the forged will, the asylum, your stepmother's intentions?" Beatrice looked him directly in the eyes. "Yes, Your Grace, every word." He held her gaze for several heartbeats, searching for something. Deception, perhaps, manipulation. Whatever he was looking for, he apparently didn't find it. "Very well," he said. "Sires, then we need to determine what to do with you. Your Grace, I don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," Arthur interrupted gently. "You knocked on my carriage door asking for help. I chose to provide it. That was my decision, Miss Langford, not yours. Now the question is what happens next." He reached beneath his seat and withdrew a small leather portfolio, correspondence and papers requiring his attention, apparently. He began sorting through them with practiced efficiency. "We're approximately 3 hours from my estate in Derbyshire," he said, not looking up from the papers. "You'll stay there tonight. Tomorrow, when you've rested and we've both had time to think clearly, we'll discuss more permanent arrangements. Your Grace, I couldn't possibly—" "You can and you will." Arthur's tone was firm, but not unkind. "You're injured, exhausted, and have nowhere else to go. I'm not leaving you on a street corner in the rain to fend for yourself. That's not—" He paused. "That's not who I am." There was something in the way he said it, something weighted with old grief or old promises. Beatrice wanted to ask, but couldn't find the courage. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said instead. I'm truly grateful." Arthur simply nodded and returned his attention to the papers spread across his lap. Silence fell again, but it was different now, less tense, almost companionable. Beatrice allowed herself to relax fractionally against the cushioned seat. Her body was beginning to register the full extent of her exhaustion. Her eyes felt heavy. The rhythmic sway of the carriage was almost hypnotic. She tried to stay awake. It seemed rude to fall asleep in the Duke's carriage after he'd been kind enough to help her. But exhaustion was a relentless opponent. Her eyes drifted closed. When they opened again, she wasn't sure how much later, Arthur was still working on his papers. One document lay partially visible on the seat beside him. Columns of numbers, ledger entries. Beatrice's tired eyes caught on a figure that made her frown despite her exhaustion. That sum was wrong. She blinked, trying to focus. Yes, definitely wrong. The third column didn't add up correctly. Arthur noticed her staring. "Something wrong, Miss Langford." Beatrice hesitated. It wasn't her business. She should stay quiet. She'd already imposed enough on this man's generosity. But old habits died hard. Her father had trained those instincts too deeply. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said carefully. "I don't mean to pry, but that column, the figures don't add correctly." Arthur blinked, looked down at the paper. "I beg your pardon. The third column, Your Grace. The sum at the bottom. It should be 247, not 267. She caught herself, realizing how presumptuous she must sound. "I'm sorry. My father trained me to notice such things. I shouldn't have said anything." "No?" Arthur picked up the paper, studying it more closely in the lamplight. After a moment, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're absolutely right. The total is incorrect." He set the paper aside and looked at her with new interest, new assessment. "And your father trained you in accounting?" he asked. "Among other things, Your Grace, he was a merchant, textiles primarily, but he had investments in shipping as well. He believed women should understand finance." Beatrice's voice softened with memory. "He said it was the only way to avoid being cheated. A wise man. Your father. He was, Your Grace." Beatrice's throat tightened, until Cordelia convinced him otherwise. Arthur didn't press for details, simply nodded and returned to his papers. But Beatrice noticed he set the incorrect ledger aside, separate from the others. Noticed the way his eyes returned to her thoughtfully once or twice during the remaining journey. She'd shown her hand without meaning to. Revealed a skill that well-bred young ladies weren't supposed to possess. Whether that would help or hurt her, only time would tell. The rain finally stopped as they traveled further north. Moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating countryside that looked nothing like London. Rolling hills, dark forests, open fields. Beatrice had never been to Derbyshire, had rarely travelled outside London at all. Everything felt foreign, uncertain. And yet, sitting in this carriage with a duke who'd opened his door to a desperate stranger, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safe, for now, at least. Beatrice woke to Arthur's voice cutting gently through her dreams. "Miss Langford, we've arrived." She blinked awake, disoriented. For one terrible moment she thought she was back in her locked bedroom at Cordelia's townhouse, that everything had been a desperate dream. Then she saw Arthur sitting across from her, real and solid, and remembered the escape, the carriage, the Duke of Silverton, who'd kept her safe through the night. "I apologize, Your Grace," she said, mortified. "I didn't mean to fall asleep. That was terribly rude of me." "You were exhausted," Arthur said simply. "No apology necessary." He gestured toward the window. "We're at Silverton Manor now." Beatrice shifted to look outside, and her breath caught. Even in the darkness, the house was imposing. 3 stories of grey stone, windows glowing with lamplight that looked impossibly warm and welcoming after the cold London rain. Formal gardens extended in ordered rows, just visible in the light spilling from the windows. Beyond that, she could make out the dark shapes of rolling hills silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was beautiful, and utterly, completely beyond anything she had any right to be part of. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I shouldn't be here. This is, if anyone sees me arriving like this, at this hour, in this condition," she gestured helplessly at herself. "Your reputation, my reputation, is my concern, not yours." Arthur interrupted firmly, but not unkindly. "And no one will see you arrive except my staff, all of whom are discreet and loyal. We'll use the side entrance." He opened the carriage door and stepped down into the gravel drive, then turned back to offer his hand. Beatrice took it carefully and allowed him to help her down. The moment her feet touched the ground, pain shot through her cut soles. She winced despite trying to hide it, and her legs, stiff from hours of sitting, nearly buckled beneath her. Arthur's hand immediately moved to her elbow, steadying her. "Can you walk, Miss Langford?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace," Beatrice said, determined to maintain some dignity. "Feels imperfectly capable of—" She took one step and her legs gave out completely. Arthur caught her before she could fall, his other arm coming around her waist for support. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Beatrice said, mortified. "I don't mean to be such a burden. I just need a moment to—" "You need medical attention and rest," Arthur said. "Fasten carrying you is faster than waiting for your legs to remember how to function." Before Beatrice could protest, he'd swept her up into his arms, as though she weighed nothing at all. "Your Grace!" Her protest was automatic. "This is entirely inappropriate. I can walk if you just give me a moment." "Miss Langford." Arthur was already moving toward a side entrance, his stride steady despite the added weight. "I've just spent 4 hours in a carriage with an unchaperoned woman fleeing an asylum commitment. Carrying you the final 20 yards is hardly going to make the situation more scandalous." Despite everything, Beatrice felt a startled laugh escape. "That's not particularly reassuring, Your Grace." "I'm aware. I'm working on my reassuring technique." He shouldered open a narrow door and carried her into a warm, lamplit corridor. The smell hit Beatrice immediately. Beeswax candles, wood smoke, bread baking somewhere distant. The smells of a home that was lived in and cared for. An elderly woman appeared from a doorway almost immediately, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at Arthur carrying a bedraggled, bleeding woman and didn't even blink. "Your Grace," she said calmly, as though this were a perfectly normal Tuesday evening. "Says I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." "Plans changed, Mrs. Dawson." Arthur set Beatrice down carefully on a wooden bench against the wall. "This is Miss Langford. She's had a difficult evening and will be staying with us for the foreseeable future." Mrs. Dawson's shrewd eyes took in Beatrice's condition with one efficient sweep. The ruined dress, the bandaged hands, the bare, bleeding feet. Her expression softened immediately with understanding and sympathy. "I see," she said, in a tone that suggested she saw quite a bit more than Arthur had actually explained. She turned to Beatrice with a kind smile. "Miss Langford, welcome to Silverton Manor. I'm Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper. Let's get you upstairs and properly tended to, shall we?" "I don't want to be any trouble," Beatrice began, though her voice wavered with exhaustion. "Trouble is part of my job, dear," Mrs. Dawson said warmly. "You're merely a guest who needs assistance. There's a significant difference." She looked at Arthur. "Shall I have her put in the blue room, Your Grace?" "Please, and have hot water sent up immediately. Clean bandages, whatever she needs." "Of course, Your Grace." Mrs. Dawson looked back at Beatrice with gentle assessment. "Can you manage the stairs, miss? Or should I have a footman?" "I can manage," Beatrice said quickly, pushing herself to her feet. Her legs protested but held. She would not be carried up the stairs like an invalid. She'd already imposed far too much on these people's hospitality. "Stubborn," Arthur observed to Mrs. Dawson. "Add that to Miss Langford's list of characteristics. I'll make a note, Your Grace," Mrs. Dawson said with barely suppressed amusement. Beatrice shot Arthur a look that she hoped conveyed appropriate gratitude mixed with mild reproach. "I'm standing right here, Your Grace. I'm aware, Miss Langford. I'm attempting to prepare my staff for what they're dealing with. It's only fair to warn them." Mrs. Dawson made a sound that definitely was a suppressed laugh this time. "Come along, Miss Langford. Let's get you settled before His Grace decides to catalogue any more of your qualities." Beatrice allowed herself to be led toward a narrow staircase, but she looked back once at Arthur. He stood in the corridor, still in his travel clothes, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said again, because it seemed desperately important to keep saying it, to make sure he understood how much his kindness meant for everything. Arthur inclined his head. "Rest well, Miss Langford. Tomorrow we'll sort out the details of your situation." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Dawson tugged gently at Beatrice's elbow, and she allowed herself to be guided up the stairs. Behind them, she heard Arthur speak quietly to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Dawson?" The housekeeper paused. "Yes, Your Grace?" "No one outside this household is to know Miss Langford is here. Not the staff in London, not the neighbours, no one. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace." "Good. Also, in the morning, please inform Nicholas that we have a guest. I'd rather he heard it from you than discovered her himself and thought I'd brought home a vagrant." Mrs. Dawson's voice was dry. "I'll phrase it tactfully, Your Grace." "I appreciate that." Beatrice frowned as they continued climbing. "Nicholas, ma'am?" "His Grace's son," Mrs. Dawson explained. 7 years old, sharp as they come. "But," She paused, choosing her words carefully. He's had a difficult time of it since his mother passed. Doesn't take well to strangers, I'm afraid. I understand, Beatrice said quietly. She understood loss, understood grief, understood not trusting new people in your life. They reached the second floor and walked down a carpeted hallway lined with doors and family portraits. Mrs. Dawson stopped at one near the end and opened it to reveal a bedroom that made Beatrice's throat tight. It was beautiful. Soft blue wallpaper, a four-poster bed with heavy curtains already turned down, a writing desk by the window, a fireplace with wood laid ready to be lit. More comfort and luxury than Beatrice had seen in months. "It's too much," she whispered. "It's a guest room, dear. We have several. This one's rarely used, so you're not putting anyone out." Mrs. Dawson moved efficiently around the space, lighting candles, checking that everything was in order. "Now, I'll have hot water brought up for washing, and I'll find you something clean to wear." She paused, a flicker of sadness crossing her lined face. "You look to be about the same size as the late Duchess was," she said quietly. "She passed 7 years ago, childbirth." Mrs. Dawson's voice softened with old grief. "His Grace keeps her things. I think he's not quite ready to let them go, but she had a kind heart. The Duchess never turned away anyone in need. She'd have wanted her clothing used, especially for someone in your circumstances." Beatrice's throat constricted. "I shouldn't. It doesn't seem right to wear a dead woman's clothes." "The Duchess would have insisted," Mrs. Dawson said firmly. "And His Grace. He tries to honor her memory by continuing what she started, being kind when he could just as easily look away." She met Beatrice's eyes. "That's why he brought you here, miss. Not out of pity, out of promise." "Promise, ma'am?" But Mrs. Dawson just shook her head gently. "That's his story to tell, not mine. Now, sit down before you fall down. I'll be back shortly with everything you need." The housekeeper bustled out, leaving Beatrice alone in the blue room. She sank onto the edge of the bed, softer than anything she'd felt in months, and simply sat there, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a few hours. This morning she'd been a prisoner in Cordelia's house, hours away from being committed to an asylum. Tonight she was in Derbyshire, in a duke's home, being offered safety by a man who'd opened his door to a desperate stranger. It felt unreal, like something from a story. Beatrice looked down at her bandaged hands, at the ruined dress, at her bloody feet, leaving marks on the beautiful carpet. That was real enough. A knock sounded, and 2 young maids entered carrying buckets of steaming water. They bobbed quick curtsies, eyes wide with curiosity, but said nothing as they set about filling a copper bath that Beatrice hadn't even noticed standing behind a decorative screen in the corner. Mrs. Dawson returned with an armful of clothing, a nightgown, a dressing robe, and a simple day dress in soft, grey wool, and set them carefully on the bed. "Fear the bath's ready when you are, miss," she said. "I'll help you with those bandages, then leave you to wash in peace. Ring if you need anything. The bell pull is by the bed." The maids curtsied again and left. Mrs. Dawson moved to help Beatrice with the soaked, ruined dress, her movements gentle and efficient. When Beatrice was finally alone behind the screen, sinking into the hot water, she felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, not from fear, from the simple, overwhelming relief of being clean, of being warm, of being, for the first time in so long, safe. She allowed herself 5 minutes to simply exist in that water, to let the heat soak into her aching muscles and ease the worst of the pain. Then she forced herself to focus on practicalities. Tomorrow she would meet Arthur's son. Tomorrow they would discuss what came next. Tomorrow she would have to figure out how to navigate this impossible situation, a fallen woman with no prospects, dependent on the charity of a duke she'd known for less than a day. But tonight, she would accept the gift she'd been given. Tonight, she would rest. Beatrice woke to birdsong, not the harsh cawing of London crows, but actual songbirds. Many of them, performing with the kind of cheerful enthusiasm that suggested they'd never heard of the concept of sleeping in. For a disoriented moment, she had no idea where she was. Then, memory returned. The escape, the carriage, Arthur Silverton, Duke of Silverton, who'd brought her to his estate in Derbyshire and offered her shelter for the night. Beatrice opened her eyes to find sunlight streaming through the windows of the blue room. Everything looked even lovelier in daylight. The periwinkle wallpaper, the polished furniture, the view of formal gardens and rolling hills beyond. She sat up slowly, wincing as every muscle in her body protested. Her hands were stiff beneath their bandages, Her feet throbbed. But she was alive and free, for now at least. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Miss Langford?" Mrs. Dawson's voice came through. "Are you awake, dear?" "Yes, ma'am. Please come in." The housekeeper entered carrying a breakfast tray, tea, toast with butter and jam, soft-boiled eggs. The smell made Beatrice's stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. "I thought you might want something before facing the day," Mrs. Dawson said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "His Grace asked that I see to your needs this morning." "That's very kind of him," Beatrice said. "And of you, ma'am." "No trouble at all, dear." Mrs. Dawson helped Beatrice stand and guided her to the chair. "Now, let me look at those feet while you eat. They'll need fresh bandages." It wasn't a suggestion. Beatrice sat obediently and accepted the cup of tea Mrs. Dawson poured. The first sip was heaven, hot, properly sweetened, quality tea, not the cheap leaves Cordelia had started buying after their father died. Mrs. Dawson knelt with surprising grace for a woman of her years and began unwrapping Beatrice's feet with gentle efficiency. "His Grace is in his study," Mrs. Dawson said conversationally as she worked. "He's been there since dawn, I'm told. He's an early riser, always has been, likes to get work done before the household properly wakes." "He works very hard then," Beatrice observed. "The estate is large, and His Grace takes his responsibilities seriously." Mrs. Dawson applied fresh ointment to the cuts, something that stung but would help prevent infection, especially since his steward passed away 3 months ago. The poor man was quite elderly, served the family for 40 years. Beatrice thought of the ledger she'd seen in the carriage, the incorrect calculations. Was he still competent at the end? Mrs. Dawson's hands paused fractionally. "That's a delicate question, miss." "Forgive me, ma'am. I didn't mean to pry." "No, you're quite right to wonder." Mrs. Dawson resumed her work, wrapping fresh bandages with practiced hands. "Between you and me, I think Mr. Pemberton's mind wasn't quite what it used to be in his final years. His Grace was too kind to force retirement, and by the time Pemberton passed, the accounts were," she sighed, "a bit of a mess, truth be told." "I see. Do you?" Mrs. Dawson looked up shrewdly. "His Grace mentioned you noticed an error in one of his ledgers last night." Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I shouldn't have said anything. It was presumptuous." "It was observant," Mrs. Dawson corrected. "And useful, I suspect. His Grace has been drowning in paperwork for months, trying to sort out what Pemberton left behind." She finished the last bandage and stood. "There now. Those should hold. Try not to put too much weight on them today if you can help it." "I'll be careful, ma'am, thank you." Mrs. Dawson moved to the wardrobe and began pulling out the grey wool dress. "This should fit you well enough." It was one of the Duchess's day dresses, simple but good quality. "What was she like?" Beatrice asked quietly. "The Duchess?" Mrs. Dawson's expression softened with memory and grief. "Kind," she said simply. "Truly kind, not just polite. She had a way of seeing people, really seeing them, you understand. The lowest scullery maid got the same courtesy as the highest lord." She smoothed the dress almost reverently, and she loved His Grace deeply. You could see it in how she looked at him, like he'd hung the moon just for her, and he loved her very much. They were partners in the truest sense. She managed the household and tenants, he managed the estate business, and they met in the middle to make decisions together. Mrs. Dawson's voice grew quieter. "When she died bringing Nicholas into the world, His Grace, well, he lost himself for a long while. 7 years on, he's learned to carry on, to do his duty. But that warmth the Duchess brought out in him, I haven't seen it since the day we buried her." Beatrice absorbed this, sipping her tea. Arthur Silverton was a man haunted by grief and promises to the dead. That explained some of his behavior last night, the careful control, the sudden compassion for a desperate stranger. "Eat your breakfast, dear," Mrs. Dawson said gently. "His Grace wants to speak with you when you're ready." Beatrice ate quickly but properly, mindful of her table manners despite the hunger gnawing at her. The food was simple but perfectly prepared. Real butter, fresh bread that had been baked that morning, eggs cooked exactly right. When she'd finished, Mrs. Dawson helped her into the grey dress. It fit reasonably well, though it was slightly loose in the bodice. The late Duchess had been a bit fuller-figured, apparently. "Your hair," Mrs. Dawson said, studying Beatrice critically. "Let's do something simple but neat." 20 minutes later, Beatrice's brown hair was pulled into a tidy knot at the base of her neck. Not fashionable, perhaps, but appropriate and practical. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but clean and presentable. She looked like a governess, or a paid companion, respectable but unremarkable. Perhaps that was safest. "Ready, dear?" Mrs. Dawson asked. Beatrice took a steadying breath. "Ready, ma'am?" They descended the main staircase this time. No more servants climbing stairs. The house was even more impressive in full daylight. High ceilings with ornate plasterwork, elegant furnishings that spoke of old wealth carefully maintained, family portraits lining the walls, generations of Silvertons watching her pass with painted eyes. This was a world so far above her current circumstances that it felt almost dreamlike. Mrs. Dawson stopped before a heavy oak door. "His Grace's study. Knock before entering, if you please. He values his privacy when working." "Of course. Thank you, ma'am, for everything." "You're very welcome, dear." Mrs. Dawson smiled kindly. "And don't look so nervous. His Grace doesn't bite. He's just direct. Prefers plain speaking to pretty nonsense. I'll remember that, ma'am." Mrs. Dawson walked away, leaving Beatrice alone in the corridor with her racing heart and sweating palms. She raised her hand and knocked. "Come in," Arthur's voice called from within. Beatrice opened the door and stepped inside. The study was exactly what she'd expected. Masculine, functional, lined with books and maps. A large desk dominated the center, covered with ledgers and correspondence in organized chaos. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the gardens, illuminating dust motes in the air. And at the desk sat Arthur Silverton, looking considerably more composed than he had in the carriage last night. He'd changed into fresh clothing, dark trousers, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a waistcoat, but no jacket. His dark hair was still damp from washing. He looked younger somehow in the morning light, less like an intimidating duke and more like a man who simply had far too much work to do. He glanced up as she entered, and something flickered in those amber eyes. Assessment, perhaps, or approval of her improved appearance. "Miss Langford," he said, setting down his pen. "Please, sit." Beatrice crossed to the chair opposite his desk and sat carefully, mindful of her bandaged feet and her borrowed dress, and every rule of propriety she was currently violating by being here, alone, with an unmarried man behind a closed door. "How do you feel this morning?" Arthur asked. "Much better, Your Grace. Thank you." Beatrice kept her hands folded properly in her lap. "The room is lovely. Mrs. Dawson has been extraordinarily kind. The breakfast was excellent. I cannot adequately express my gratitude for—" "Please don't," Arthur interrupted gently. "We established last night that excessive gratitude isn't necessary. I helped because it was the right thing to do, not because I expect endless thanks. Nevertheless, Your Grace, I am grateful." "Noted." Arthur leaned back in his chair, studying her. "We need to discuss your situation, Miss Langford. You can't remain here indefinitely without a legitimate reason for your presence." Beatrice's stomach tightened. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading, the moment when the Duke explained politely but firmly that she would need to leave. "I understand, Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice steady. "If you could perhaps recommend a coaching inn, or provide the direction to the nearest, where you'd be found within days by your stepmother's men." Arthur shook his head. "No, Miss Langford, that's not a solution. It's merely delaying the inevitable." Beatrice's hands clenched in her lap. "Then what do you suggest, Your Grace?" Arthur stood and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back in a pose that suggested he'd given this considerable thought. "There are, broadly speaking, 3 options," he said, looking out at the gardens rather than at her. "None of them ideal, but we must be practical." Beatrice waited, heart pounding. "First," Arthur continued, "I could send you away with funds and a letter of reference. You could attempt to disappear on your own, perhaps travel north to Scotland or west to Wales, change your name, find employment somewhere your stepmother wouldn't think to look." He paused. "Given Lady Cordelia's resources and apparent determination, I estimate you'd have perhaps a week before she tracked you down. 2 at most, if you're exceptionally clever about covering your trail." Beatrice's stomach sank. He was right. She knew he was right. "The second option," Arthur said, turning back to face her now, his expression carefully neutral, "is marriage." Beatrice's breath caught. The word hung in the air between them like something fragile and impossible. For one reckless heartbeat, her mind spiraled into fantasy, safety, permanence, a name that would protect her, a home that couldn't be taken away, a future that didn't involve running or hiding or fear. It was madness, complete madness. She knew the thought was foolish. They barely knew each other. "As my wife," Arthur continued, "you would be legally beyond your stepmother's reach immediately. The guardianship would transfer to me. Lady Cordelia would have no further claim on you or your inheritance. It would be—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "It was the most expedient solution." Hope flared in Beatrice's chest for one wild, impossible moment. "However," Arthur said firmly, and the hope died as quickly as it had sparked, "that option is entirely off the table." The words hit like a physical blow. Beatrice felt something inside her chest crack, which was absurd, completely absurd. She'd known him less than a day. She had no right to feel disappointed, no reason to feel this sharp, unexpected sting of rejection. "I don't know you, Miss Langford," Arthur continued, his voice kind but absolutely certain. "You don't know me. We met less than 12 hours ago, under extraordinary circumstances. Marriage would be—" He searched for the right word. "Irresponsible. To both of us, and especially to my son, who doesn't need his father making impulsive decisions that affect the entire household." "Of course, Your Grace." Beatrice forced the words out past the tightness in her throat. "I wouldn't have expected— that is, I would never presume to—" "I know you wouldn't," Arthur interrupted gently, "which is precisely why I'm being direct about it. I want no misunderstandings between us, Miss Langford. You're here because you needed help, not because I have any personal interest in you beyond basic human compassion." Each word was perfectly reasonable, perfectly logical, and each one felt like another door closing in Beatrice's face. "I understand, Your Grace," she managed. "What is the third option?" Arthur returned to his desk and sat, the businesslike demeanor returning. "Employment," he said. "A legitimate position in this household that explains your presence and provides some measure of legal protection. Not a perfect solution, but better than the alternatives." Beatrice straightened slightly, grasping at this possibility like a lifeline. "What kind of position, Your Grace?" "That's the complication." Arthur drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking. "The usual positions, governess, lady's companion, even a senior housemaid, all require references you don't possess. Hiring someone without them would raise questions I'd prefer not to answer." Silence fell. Beatrice's mind raced. There had to be something, some position she could fill that wouldn't require references she couldn't provide. "Unless," Arthur said slowly, looking at her with that assessing expression again. "Your Grace, yesterday evening, in the carriage, you spotted an error in my accounts, within seconds of glancing at a document you weren't even meant to see." Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I apologize again for that, Your Grace. I know it was forward of me to—" Arthur waved away the apology. "My steward died 3 months ago. He was elderly, trusted, served the family for 40 years, and I've recently begun to suspect that in his final years, his competence was—" Arthur paused diplomatically, declining. He gestured at the stacks of ledgers and papers surrounding them. "My accounts are in chaos, Miss Langford. I've been managing day-to-day operations, but the historical records are a disaster. I need someone who can conduct a thorough audit, someone who understands numbers and can identify discrepancies or potential fraud." Arthur looked at her directly. "Someone like you." Beatrice's pulse quickened. "Your Grace, I'm not formally trained. My father taught me, yes, but I've never—" "You spotted that error instantly," Arthur pointed out. "Your father trained you well enough to manage his business accounts. You clearly have both the skill and the experience to handle complex financial records." He paused. "So the question is whether you're willing to use those skills to help me sort out this mess." "I am, Your Grace," Beatrice said immediately, then caught herself. "But Your Grace, a woman managing a duke's accounts, that's highly irregular. People would talk." "They would indeed," Arthur agreed, "which is precisely why we wouldn't advertise the arrangement." Beatrice frowned, not understanding. Arthur stood again and moved back to the window, clearly thinking through how to phrase this. "Officially," he said, not looking at her, "you would be employed as a tutor, a companion and instructor for my son, Nicholas. He's 7 years old, intelligent, and has proven himself remarkably skilled at driving away governesses, 4 in the past year alone." "I see," Beatrice said, though she wasn't sure she did. "Nicholas needs someone patient and steady," Arthur continued. "Someone who won't be intimidated by a difficult child or give up at the first sign of trouble. Someone who can provide him with basic instruction and companionship during the day." He turned back to face her. "That would be your official position, Miss Langford, Nicholas's tutor. It's a respectable role that would explain your presence in the household, and provide you with a legitimate salary and accommodations. But in reality, Beatrice asked, in reality, Nicholas already has structured lessons with a local scholar 3 mornings a week. You would spend time with him, yes, reading, conversation, keeping him occupied, but your primary work would be here. Arthur gestured at the chaos of papers on his desk. Auditing my accounts, organizing the ledgers, training a new steward when I eventually hire one. It was clever, unconventional and possibly scandalous, but clever. The household staff would know, Beatrice pointed out. Servants always know everything. Mrs. Dawson would know the full truth, Arthur agreed. The other staff would be told you're assisting with correspondence and household accounts as part of your duties, not uncommon for a tutor in a bachelor household. It's not a perfect cover, but it should suffice. Beatrice considered this carefully. It solved her immediate problem, gave her a roof, a salary, protection from Cordelia, but it also placed her in close proximity to a duke working in his private study, with only the thinnest veneer of propriety protecting both their reputations. Your Grace, she said carefully, I'm concerned about your son. Mrs. Dawson mentioned he's had difficulties with previous governesses. Arthur's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Nicholas is intelligent, observant, and deeply mistrustful of any new person who enters his life, especially women who promise to help him. Because they leave, Beatrice said quietly. Because they always leave, Arthur confirmed. His mother died bringing him into the world. Every governess since has abandoned him within weeks when they realized he wasn't going to be an easy, grateful charge. He's learned not to trust that anyone will stay. Arthur's voice grew quieter. I won't lie to you, Miss Langford. Nicholas will make your life difficult at first. He'll test you, push boundaries, try to drive you away like he's driven away everyone else. And he paused, I haven't been the father he needs. I've been too buried in grief and estate business to see how much he's been struggling. By the time I noticed, he'd already built walls I don't know how to climb. The raw pain in Arthur's voice was difficult to hear. What if I make things worse? Beatrice asked. What if I'm just one more person who disappoints him? Then you'll be like every other adult in his life, Arthur said with brutal honesty. Myself included. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding of failure and loss. Beatrice looked at the ledgers spread across the desk, thought about 6 months of safety and a salary that could eventually purchase passage to America, thought about a 7-year-old boy who'd learned the hard way that trust was dangerous. I'll accept the position, Your Grace, she said finally. Then I'll audit your accounts, spend time with Nicholas, and do my best not to disappoint him. Or you. Arthur's shoulders relaxed fractionally. Thank you, Miss Langford. But I have conditions, Your Grace. One eyebrow rose slightly. Do you? Yes, Your Grace. Beatrice lifted her chin, gathering her courage. First, I want the arrangement in writing. A proper contract specifying my duties, my salary, and most importantly, my freedom to leave at any time if circumstances change. I won't be trapped again, Your Grace. Not by anyone, no matter how kind their intentions. Arthur studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. I'll have it drawn up today. We'll both sign it. Witnessed by Mrs. Dawson. What else? How long would this audit take, Your Grace? Realistically, for someone skilled working full-time, Arthur considered. 6 months, at least. Possibly longer, depending on what we find. 6 months, Beatrice repeated, doing quick calculations. And the salary you mentioned, if I'm careful, I could save enough in that time for passage to America. Something flickered across Arthur's face, an emotion too quick to identify. To your aunt in Boston? Yes, that would be feasible. Beatrice nodded slowly. Then my second condition, Your Grace, is this. At the end of 6 months, if I've completed the audit to your satisfaction, you'll provide me with references and assistance in securing passage to Boston. I need to know I have a future beyond this arrangement. Agreed, Arthur said without hesitation. Though I reserve the right to be disappointed if you actually leave. The words were said lightly, almost teasingly, but there was something underneath them that Beatrice couldn't quite read. Is there anything else, Miss Langford? One more thing, Your Grace. Beatrice met his gaze directly. If Nicholas truly hates me, if I'm genuinely making his life worse instead of better, you must tell me directly. I won't be kept on out of pity or obligation if I'm causing him harm. That wouldn't be fair to anyone. Arthur's expression shifted, something that looked almost like respect. You're very concerned about a child you haven't even met yet, he observed. I'm concerned about not causing more damage to a boy who's already been hurt enough, Beatrice said. "Children aren't resilient, Your Grace. They're just good at hiding their wounds." "You sound like you're speaking from experience, Miss Langford." Beatrice thought of her own childhood, of watching her mother slowly lose herself to grief and illness, of her father remarrying for practical reasons and bringing Cordelia into their lives like a viper into a garden. "I am, Your Grace." Arthur nodded slowly, seeming to understand that she wouldn't elaborate. "Very well, Miss Langford. Your conditions are acceptable. I'll have the contract prepared today. You can begin work tomorrow once everything is formalized." He moved around the desk and extended his hand formally. "Welcome to my household, Miss Langford. I hope this arrangement proves beneficial to us both." Beatrice stood and took his hand carefully. His grip was firm and warm. "Thank you, Your Grace. I'll do my best to prove worthy of your trust." "See that you do," Arthur said, but there was warmth in his voice. Almost fondness. No, Beatrice was imagining things. The Duke of Silverton had made it abundantly clear that morning that marriage was off the table, and he had no personal interest in her. This was business, employment, nothing more. And that, Beatrice told herself firmly, was perfectly fine. She didn't need romance or rescue. She needed safety and a means of eventually reaching her aunt in America. This arrangement provided exactly that. "One more thing, Miss Langford," Arthur said as she turned toward the door. "Yes, Your Grace? Nicholas will be at luncheon. I'll introduce you then. Try not to be too disappointed if he's—" Arthur searched for the word. "Unwelcoming. I've survived worse than an unwelcoming 7-year-old, Your Grace." "Somehow," Arthur said with a slight smile. "I don't doubt that for a moment." Beatrice had 3 hours before luncheon, 3 hours to prepare herself for meeting a 7-year-old boy who'd learned to hate everyone who tried to help him. She spent the first hour in her room, attempting to read a book Mrs. Dawson had provided. The words blurred together meaninglessly. Her mind kept circling back to Arthur's words in the study. "That option is entirely off the table. I have no personal interest in you beyond basic human compassion." She'd known him less than a day. She had no right to feel hurt by his rejection, and yet the ache in her chest refused to fade. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "You're being absurd. He offered you safety, employment, and a path to America. That's more than you had any right to expect." But the simple thought of marrying him had changed the way she saw him. She couldn't unsee it now. The second hour she spent exploring the grounds near the house, carefully, mindful of her bandaged feet. The gardens were beautiful, meticulously maintained. Spring flowers bloomed in ordered beds. Gravel paths wound between shaped hedges. Everything about Silverton Manor spoke of generations of wealth and care. This was a world that had never known desperation or fear. A world where doors opened because of names and titles, not because of desperate pleas in the rain. A world Beatrice would never truly belong to, no matter how long she stayed. The third hour found her back in her room, changing into a fresh dress Mrs. Dawson had provided, another of the late Duchess's gowns. This one in soft green that brought out the color in Beatrice's eyes. She studied herself in the mirror. Neat, respectable, appropriate for a tutor meeting her young charge. Nothing like the bedraggled, terrified woman who'd thrown herself at a carriage door the night before. That woman was desperate, Beatrice thought. This woman is employed. There's a significant difference. A knock sounded at the door. "Miss Langford?" Mrs. Dawson's voice. "It's time, dear." Beatrice took a steadying breath and opened the door. "Ready?" the housekeeper asked. "As ready as I'll ever be, Mrs." Dawson smiled sympathetically. "Young Nicholas can be challenging, but remember, his rudeness comes from fear, not cruelty. He's been hurt too many times." "I understand. Do you?" Mrs. Dawson studied her shrewdly. "Most people say they understand. Few actually do." "I lost my mother when I was 12, Beatrice said quietly. "Scarlet fever. My father remarried 3 years later, not out of love, but out of loneliness and the belief that I needed a mother figure." She paused, remembering. "But you can't replace someone, and pretending you can only makes the loss hurt more. I know what it's like when adults expect you to simply accept their decisions and move forward, as though grief was something you could schedule and complete on someone else's timeline." She met Mrs. Dawson's eyes. "Nicholas has every right to be angry, every right to protect himself, and I won't ask him to pretend otherwise just to make the adults around him more comfortable." Mrs. Dawson's expression softened. "Then perhaps you're exactly what the boy needs." They descended to the dining room, a smaller, more intimate space than Beatrice had expected. Not the formal great hall she'd imagined, but a family dining room with windows overlooking the gardens and a table sized for perhaps 8 people at most. Arthur was already there, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as they entered. "Miss Langford," he said with a formal nod. "Thank you for joining us." "Of course, Your Grace." There was a distance in his manner now that hadn't been there in the study that morning. A careful politeness that felt like a wall between them. "Good," Beatrice told herself. "That's appropriate. That's how it should be. So why did it sting?" "Nicholas should be down momentarily," Arthur continued. "I've informed him that you're my new employee, here to assist with estate business and to spend time with him during the day." "How did he respond, Your Grace?" "He didn't." Arthur's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Says which is often worse than an argument." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Slow, deliberate. A boy appeared in the doorway. Nicholas Silverton was small for 7, thin in the way of children who forgot to eat when stressed. He had his father's dark hair, though his was slightly longer, falling into his eyes, and his mother's features, delicate and fine-boned. But his eyes were old, too old for a child. The kind of eyes that had seen too much loss and learned not to trust promises. Beatrice recognized those eyes. She'd seen them in her own mirror often enough. Nicholas didn't look at her directly. His gaze slid past her as though she weren't there, fixing instead on his father. "Father," he said. His voice was carefully neutral, polite but empty. "Nicholas." Arthur's voice held warmth, but also uncertainty, as though he weren't quite sure how to bridge the distance between them. "This is Miss Langford. She'll be working at Silverton Manor for the foreseeable future." Nicholas's gaze finally moved to Beatrice, assessed her with one quick, comprehensive sweep. She could practically see him cataloguing new governess. "Number 5, probably gone within a month." "How do you do, Miss Langford?" he said with perfect, hollow courtesy. "Very well, thank you, Master Nicholas," Beatrice replied, matching his formality. She didn't curtsy. That would have been excessive, but she inclined her head respectfully. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "I'm sure." Nicholas moved to his chair at the table, the one furthest from his father, Beatrice noticed, and sat with the careful precision of someone performing a role. Arthur gestured for Beatrice to sit. She took the chair between father and son, acutely aware that she was literally placing herself in the middle of whatever complicated dance they'd been performing for years. Servants entered with the first course, a light soup, perfectly seasoned. They ate in silence for several minutes. Beatrice was painfully conscious of every sound, the clink of silver on china, the quiet footsteps of servants, the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. Nicholas ate mechanically, his attention fixed on his bowl, not eating with appetite but fulfilling an obligation. Just like his father, Beatrice thought, both of them going through the motions of a family meal without any of the warmth that should accompany it. "Miss Langford will be spending her mornings with you, Nicholas," Arthur said, breaking the silence. "Reading, conversation, perhaps some light instruction in subjects that interest you." "I already have lessons with Mr. Pemberton 3 times a week," Nicholas said to his soup. "I'm aware Miss Langford will supplement those lessons, not replace them." "I see." The words were polite. The tone was anything but. Beatrice set down her spoon carefully. "Master Nicholas, may I ask what subjects you're currently studying with Mr. Pemberton?" Nicholas finally looked at her directly. "Latin, mathematics, history, the usual requirements for a gentleman's education." "Do you enjoy any of them?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Enjoy? Yes. Is there a subject that interests you, that you look forward to studying?" Nicholas considered this for a long moment, as though no one had ever asked him what he actually wanted to learn. "History," he said finally. "Sometimes, when Mr. Pemberton talks about battles and strategies instead of just making me memorize dates." "Battles and strategies," Beatrice repeated thoughtfully. "Do you prefer land battles or naval?" Another pause. I don't know. Mr. Pemberton doesn't usually let me ask questions like that." "Well, I'm not Mr. Pemberton," Beatrice said, "so you're welcome to ask as many questions as you like. I may not always have the answers, but I promise I won't discourage curiosity." Nicholas's eyes narrowed slightly. Not hostile exactly, but deeply suspicious. "Why?" he asked. "Why what? Why would you promise that? You don't know me. I could ask irritating questions constantly just to bother you." "You could," Beatrice agreed. "And if your questions become genuinely disruptive, I'll tell you so directly. But I've found that most people ask questions because they actually want to learn, not because they want to irritate anyone. Most people aren't me." There was a challenge in his voice. "A test." Beatrice met his gaze steadily. No, they're not. But I suspect you're more interesting than most people. Nicholas blinked. Clearly, he'd expected a different response. Agreement that, yes, he was difficult. An attempt to flatter him. Something predictable. So you don't know anything about me, he said. That's true, Beatrice admitted. But I know what it's like when adults make assumptions about who you are without bothering to actually ask. So I thought I'd try a different approach, which is treating you like a person capable of honest conversation instead of a problem to be managed. Silence fell again, but it was different now. Less hostile, more considering. Arthur had gone very still, watching this exchange with an expression Beatrice couldn't quite read. Miss Langford, Nicholas said carefully, how long do you plan to stay at Silverton Manor? It was the real question, the one that mattered. Beatrice could have lied, could have promised to stay forever, the way she suspected every other governess had done. But she'd promised herself honesty, and she'd promised Arthur not to make things worse. 6 months, she said. Possibly longer, depending on how the work progresses. But I won't lie to you, Nicholas. I don't intend to stay permanently. I have family in America. I hope to join eventually. Nicholas's face closed down immediately. I see. So you're temporary, like all the others. I'm honest, Beatrice corrected gently. Unlike the others, apparently. I won't promise you forever when I can't guarantee it. But I will promise you 6 months of my full attention and effort. That's more than most people offer. 6 months and then you'll leave, Nicholas said flatly. 6 months and then we'll see where circumstances stand, Beatrice amended. But yes, eventually I'll probably leave. Most people do. Nicholas, that's not a reflection on you, it's simply how life works. That's a terrible answer. It's an honest answer. Nicholas pushed his soup bowl away. May I be excused, Father? Arthur's jaw tightened. You haven't finished? I'm not hungry. Nicholas, please, Father, may I be excused? The formality was a wall, a way of keeping distance. Arthur looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to force his son to stay, to engage, to be present. But Beatrice saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the resignation of someone who'd fought this battle too many times and lost. You may go, Arthur said quietly. Nicholas stood immediately, bowed with perfect courtesy to Beatrice, as though she were visiting nobility instead of a temporary employee, and left without another word. His footsteps faded down the corridor. Arthur and Beatrice sat in the suddenly too quiet dining room. That went well, Arthur said with bitter humor. It could have been worse, Your Grace. He barely spoke to you. He spoke honestly when he did, Beatrice pointed out. That's more valuable than pleasant lies. Arthur looked at her directly for the first time since luncheon began, really looked, with those penetrating amber eyes that seemed to see far too much. You told him you'd leave. I told him the truth, Your Grace. That seemed more important than making promises I couldn't keep. Every other governess promised to stay, and every other governess broke that promise, Beatrice said. I won't lie to him, Your Grace. Not even kindly meant lies. He's had enough of those. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. He liked you, he said finally. Beatrice blinked. Your Grace, I don't think he engaged with you, Arthur interrupted. Asked questions, responded honestly instead of just giving empty courtesy. He paused. That's more than he's done with anyone new in years. He's testing me, Beatrice said, trying to determine whether I'm worth the risk of trusting. And are you? The question was quiet but weighed with meaning beyond the words. Beatrice met Arthur's gaze. I don't know, Your Grace. I hope so, but I suppose we'll both find out together. After luncheon, Beatrice returned to her room to collect herself before beginning work on the accounts. She'd barely closed the door when she noticed something on her bed. A book. Not one that had been there that morning. Someone had placed it deliberately while she was at luncheon. Beatrice crossed the room and picked it up carefully. A military history of the Roman Empire, detailed illustrations of battle formations, maps of famous campaigns, exactly the kind of book a 7-year-old boy fascinated by military strategy might treasure. A piece of paper was tucked inside, folded precisely. Beatrice unfolded it with careful fingers. The handwriting was careful, practiced, but still bearing the slight irregularities of a child's hand. If you want to know about battles, this book has the best pictures. The chapter on Cannae is most interesting. Father says I may lend it to you if you promise to return it undamaged. Nicholas Silverton. Beatrice sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the book clutched in her hands. He'd lent her his book, not given, lent, with specific conditions about its return, because he valued it, because he expected to get it back, because he was, despite all his walls and suspicion, still a child who wanted to share something he loved. "Oh, Nicholas," Beatrice thought, her throat unexpectedly tight. "You're trying so hard not to care." She smoothed the note carefully and tucked it back into the book. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and went to find Arthur's study. It was time to begin earning her keep. Arthur looked up when Beatrice knocked and entered. He'd changed into even more casual attire. Shirt sleeves without the waistcoat now, collar loosened, working clothes for a long afternoon of paperwork. It made him look younger, more approachable. "Stop it," Beatrice told herself firmly. "He's your employer, nothing more." "Miss Langford," Arthur said, setting down his pen. "Ready to face the chaos." "As ready as I'll ever be, Your Grace." Arthur stood and gestured to the desk, which was even more crowded with ledgers and papers than it had been that morning. "Where would you like me to begin, Your Grace?" "Wherever makes the most sense to you. You're the expert in this particular disaster." Arthur moved to a second, smaller desk positioned near the window. "I'll be here working on current business. If you have questions, ask. Otherwise," he gestured at the chaos, "do what you do." Beatrice approached the main desk and began examining the ledgers systematically. Within 10 minutes, she'd identified the scope of the problem. Within 30, she'd found 3 more instances of deliberate miscalculation. Within an hour, she'd realized the previous steward had been systematically embezzling for at least 5 years. "Your Grace," she said, without looking up from the ledger she was annotating. "Yes? How much did you trust Mr. Pemberton?" There was a pause. "Completely. He served my father before me. 30 years of loyal service. Why?" "Because," Beatrice said, finally looking up to meet Arthur's eyes, "he was stealing from you, consistently, cleverly, and for far longer than you realized." Arthur's face went carefully blank. "How much? I'll need several more hours to calculate the full extent, but from what I've seen so far," Beatrice gestured at the ledgers, "at least £2,000, possibly more." The sum hung in the air between them. Arthur stood slowly and crossed to the desk. "Show me." Beatrice did, walked him through the patterns of altered sums, the receipts that didn't quite match the ledger entries, the careful way Pemberton had scattered the theft across multiple accounts to avoid detection. "Bloody hell," Arthur said quietly when she'd finished. "I trusted him with everything. He betrayed that trust, Your Grace, systematically and deliberately." Arthur's jaw was tight with barely contained fury. "How can we recover any of it?" "That depends on what he did with the money. If he spent it, no. If he invested it or stored it somewhere," Beatrice shook her head, "that would require investigation beyond my abilities. Perhaps a solicitor or investigator." "I'll write to my solicitor in London immediately." Arthur looked at the ledgers with something like disgust. 30 years. My father trusted him. I trusted him. "And all that time, he was stealing from you," Beatrice finished. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I know that's not what you wanted to hear." "No," Arthur met her eyes, "but it's what I needed to know. Thank you, Miss Langford, for finding this. It's what you hired me to do, Your Grace." Still, something in his expression softened slightly. "Thank you." They worked in companionable silence for the next 2 hours. Arthur at his desk managing current estate business, Beatrice at the larger desk methodically working through the historical ledgers. It was peaceful, somehow. The scratch of pens on paper, the occasional rustle of pages turning, sunlight moving slowly across the floor as afternoon progressed toward evening. Beatrice found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since before her father's death. There was something soothing about numbers, about problems that had clear, logical solutions, unlike everything else in her life, which seemed to exist in a permanent state of complicated uncertainty. "Miss Langford," she looked up. Arthur was watching her with an odd expression. "Yes, Your Grace. Nicholas left you a book." It wasn't a question. "He did," Beatrice confirmed. "A military history. He said I might borrow it if I promised to return it undamaged. That's his favorite book. My father gave it to him before—" Arthur paused. "Before the late Duke passed away 2 years ago. Nicholas has read it dozens of times. Then I'll take excellent care of it, Your Grace. He doesn't lend it to anyone," Arthur continued quietly. "I've seen him refuse to let even Mrs. Dawson look at it. He keeps it on his bedside table like a treasure." Beatrice's throat tightened. "I'm honored by his trust." "So am I." Arthur's gaze was intense. "You did something today, Miss Langford, something I haven't been able to do in 7 years. You made him care enough to share something he values. He was testing me, Your Grace, trying to see if I'd respect something important to him, And you passed. Arthur smiled slightly. Perhaps there's hope for both of you yet. I hope so, Your Grace. They returned to their work, but something had shifted between them. Some small easing of the careful distance Arthur had maintained all day. Beatrice tried not to read too much into it, tried not to remember the way her heart had leaped that morning when he'd mentioned marriage, tried not to imagine what might have happened if he'd said yes instead of firmly closing that door. Stop it, she told herself for the 100th time. He's your employer, you're his employee. That's all this is, all it can ever be. But as the afternoon sunlight gilded Arthur's profile and the peaceful silence stretched between them, Beatrice couldn't quite convince herself that was true. Dinner was a quieter affair than luncheon had been. Nicholas appeared when summoned, still carefully polite and carefully distant, but when Beatrice mentioned she'd begun reading his book, something flickered in his eyes. "What do you think of the Cannae chapter?" he asked, trying to sound disinterested and failing. "I think Hannibal was brilliant," Beatrice said honestly. "The double envelopment strategy was revolutionary, though I wonder if it could have worked without the Carthaginian cavalry superiority." Nicholas sat up straighter. "That's exactly what I thought. Mr. Pemberton said I was being too focused on minor details, but the cavalry positioning was crucial to the entire—" He stopped abruptly, as though remembering he wasn't supposed to care, but the mask had slipped. Just for a moment, Arthur was watching them both with an expression that made Beatrice's chest ache. Hope mixed with fear, the look of a father who'd almost given up and was terrified to believe things might actually improve. "I'd be interested to hear your full thoughts on the battle, Nicholas," Beatrice said casually. "Perhaps tomorrow morning we could discuss it. I'm sure you have insights I haven't considered." Nicholas picked at his food. "That perhaps—" It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't refusal either. Progress. After dinner, Beatrice excused herself to return to her room. The day had been long and emotionally exhausting. She needed time alone to process everything. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss Langford." She turned to find Arthur at the base of the stairs, one hand on the banister. "Yes, Your Grace." He seemed to struggle with something for a moment. "Then, thank you for today, for Nicholas, for all of it. You don't need to thank me, Your Grace. It's my job." "No," Arthur said. "It's more than that. And we both know it." The words hung between them in the dimly lit stairwell. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs. "Your Grace, don't," she thought desperately. "Don't say something that will make this impossible." "I watched you with Nicholas today," Arthur said quietly, "and I realized—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in frustration, looked up at her with eyes that held too much emotion for Beatrice to decipher. "I realized you've brought something back to this house that I thought was gone forever. Hope, perhaps, or possibility. I'm not even certain what to call it." His jaw tightened. "But it's there, and it terrifies me." Beatrice couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stand there looking down at him and wondering what he meant, what he wanted, what he was trying to say without saying. "Your Grace, I don't—" "Good night, Miss Langford," Arthur said abruptly, cutting off whatever she'd been about to say. "Sleep well. We have much work to do tomorrow." He turned and walked back toward his study with quick, deliberate steps, as though fleeing something or someone. Beatrice stood frozen on the stairs, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He'd thanked her, that was all. Simple gratitude for helping his son and managing his accounts. So why had it felt like so much more? Why had the way he looked at her made her chest ache and her pulse race? Why had his voice sounded like he was saying goodbye to something he wanted, but couldn't have? She didn't sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Arthur's voice echoing in her mind. "You've brought something back to this house." She'd known him barely 2 days. She was his employee, a charity case with nothing to offer but competence with numbers. What had she brought? And why did he sound both grateful for it and terrified of it? She didn't have answers, only questions that kept her awake far into the night. And yet when morning came and she descended to breakfast, her pulse quickened at the thought of seeing him again. When she entered the dining room and found Arthur already there, reading his correspondence, her breath caught. He looked up. Their eyes met. But something changed. "Good morning, Miss Langford," Arthur said, his voice carefully neutral, cold, not angry, not unkind. "Good morning, Your Grace." And that was it. No warmth. No acknowledgement of the moment on the stairs last night. Beatrice tried to tell herself it was for the best, tried to focus on the work, on the 6 months ahead, but she couldn't stop wondering what had changed between last night and this morning. What had she done wrong? And then she realized, with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, that the next 6 months were going to be far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings belonged to Nicholas. Beatrice would find him in the library at 9 o'clock sharp, never early, never late, as though he'd calculated the exact minimum required to fulfill his obligations. He'd sit in the chair furthest from hers, a book open in his lap, projecting an air of polite disinterest, but he always came. And slowly, incrementally, the walls began to crack. The first breakthrough came on Wednesday morning. Beatrice was reading aloud from a history of the Napoleonic Wars, chosen specifically because Nicholas had mentioned an interest in military strategy. She'd reached a passage about the Battle of Waterloo when Nicholas interrupted. "That's wrong." Beatrice looked up from the book. "I beg your pardon." "The book," Nicholas said, pointing with one thin finger. "It says, Wellington positioned the reserves on the left flank, but they were on the right, behind the ridge at Hougoumont. Are you certain?" "Yes." For the first time there was real animation in Nicholas's voice, genuine emotion breaking through the careful politeness. "I've read 3 different accounts of Waterloo. They all agree the reserves were on the right, not the left. This author made a mistake." Beatrice examined the passage carefully, then looked at Nicholas with genuine respect. "You're absolutely right. This is an error." Nicholas blinked, clearly surprised. "You believe me? Why wouldn't I? You've read multiple sources on the subject. You know the material well. Just because something is printed in a book doesn't make it infallible." Beatrice made a small note in the margin. "Thank you for the correction. I'll remember that the author isn't entirely reliable on tactical details." Something shifted in Nicholas's expression. Not quite trust yet, but the beginning of possibility. The faint suggestion that perhaps this new person in his life might be different from the others. "Miss Langford." "Yes, Nicholas." He hesitated, then asked with careful casualness, "Do you actually enjoy reading about battles, or are you just pretending because you think I want you to?" It was the first truly direct question he'd asked her, the first time he'd dropped the mask of perfect politeness and simply asked what he wanted to know. Beatrice set the book down and considered her answer carefully. Honesty, she'd promised. Always honesty. "I find military strategy genuinely fascinating," she said. "Not because I enjoy violence or warfare. I don't. But strategy itself is essentially a very complex problem requiring mathematical thinking, resource management, and the ability to predict human behavior under pressure. It's rather like accounting, actually, but with significantly higher stakes." Nicholas tilted his head, studying her with those 2 old eyes. "That's a strange way to think about war." "Perhaps, but it's honest." Beatrice held his gaze steadily. "I promised I wouldn't lie to you, Nicholas, not even about small things. If you ask me a direct question, I'll give you a direct answer. Always." "Always?" There was challenge in the word. "Testing." "Always," Beatrice confirmed. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, his thin fingers tracing the edge of his book. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. "Did you really mean it? That you're leaving in 6 months?" Ah, there it was. The real question, the one that mattered more than anything else. Beatrice took a slow breath. "I meant it," she said gently. "I have an aunt in America, Boston. I've been saving money for passage since before I came here. At the end of 6 months, I should have enough to make the journey." "So you are leaving?" Nicholas's voice was carefully flat, carefully empty. "That's my plan, yes." Beatrice paused, then added carefully, "But Nicholas, plans change. Life is unpredictable. I can't promise I'll stay forever because I genuinely don't know what will happen 6 months from now. None of us do. The future is always uncertain, but you'll probably leave." "Probably," Beatrice admitted, refusing to soften the truth, even though she could see how it hurt him. "But not because of you. Not because you did anything wrong or drove me away like you drove away the governesses. Simply because I had that plan before I ever came to Silverton Manor, before I even knew you existed." Nicholas looked down at his hands, small and pale against the dark leather of his book. "The others said they'd stay forever. Every single one of them promised. And they lied to you," Beatrice said quietly. "Which was cruel, Nicholas. Deeply cruel. I won't do that. I'll tell you the truth. Even when the truth is uncomfortable or disappointing, you deserve at least that much respect." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the library clock and distant birdsong from the gardens. Then Nicholas spoke, his voice so soft Beatrice had to lean forward to hear it. "I think I prefer honest and temporary to false and permanent. Beatrice's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. So do I, Nicholas. So do I. Nicholas picked up his own book, a different military history he'd brought from his room, and opened it to a marked page. But before he began reading, he said, without looking up, "We could read together tomorrow morning, if you want. I have another book about Roman military tactics that's supposed to be quite good. It has detailed illustrations of siege equipment. It wasn't quite an invitation, barely even a suggestion, really, but it was something. A small crack in the armor, a tentative extension of trust. I'd like that very much," Beatrice said, keeping her voice calm, despite the small triumph blooming in her chest. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Silverton Manor, Nicholas smiled. Just a little, just a brief flicker at the corner of his mouth, but it was real. By Friday afternoon, the progress with Nicholas felt almost miraculous. He'd begun arriving to their morning sessions a few minutes early, books already selected and passages marked that he wanted to discuss. His questions grew bolder, more confident, and once, just once, when Beatrice made a joke about Hannibal's elephants being rather impractical for alpine crossings, Nicholas had actually laughed. A real laugh, brief and surprised, as though he'd forgotten he was capable of such a sound. But Beatrice had heard it, and apparently so had Arthur. That afternoon in the study, Arthur was unusually quiet. Beatrice worked through another ledger, documenting the steady pattern of Mr. Pemberton's embezzlement, while Arthur supposedly reviewed tenant correspondence at his own desk. But she could feel his gaze on her. Several times she looked up to find him staring, expression unreadable. Each time, he quickly returned his attention to his papers. The silence grew heavy, uncomfortable. Finally, Beatrice set down her pen. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" Arthur blinked, as though pulling himself from deep thought. "What? No. Nothing's wrong. You've been staring at me for the past 20 minutes. I haven't." He stopped, caught. "My apologies. I was merely thinking." "About what, if I may ask?" Arthur set down his own pen with careful precision. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Nicholas laughed this morning." Beatrice felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Sally elephants were objectively ridiculous when you think about it practically. He hasn't laughed in months," Arthur continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "Not genuinely, not the way he used to before." He trailed off, but Beatrice knew what he'd left unsaid before his mother died. "He's a remarkable child, Your Grace," Beatrice said carefully. "Intelligent, perceptive. He just needed someone who wouldn't give up on him. 4 governesses gave up on him in less than a year," Arthur said. 4 educated, experienced women who came with impeccable references. And you, with no formal training, no references at all, managed to reach him in less than a week. There was something in his tone that Beatrice couldn't quite identify. Not quite admiration, not quite something else. "I haven't done anything special, Your Grace. I've simply been honest with him." "You told him you're leaving." The words hung in the air. "I did," Beatrice confirmed, "because it's the truth. He deserved to know." Arthur stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her. His shoulders were tense, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "He's attaching to you," Arthur said to the glass. "I can see it. The way he watches for you in the mornings. The way he brings you books he wants to share. The way he started to—" Arthur's voice roughened. "The way he started to hope again." Beatrice's chest tightened. "Your Grace, and in 6 months, you'll leave," Arthur continued, still not turning around. "You'll go to America, and he'll lose someone else he's dared to care about, and I don't—" He stopped, took a visible breath. "I don't know how to protect him from that without asking you to give up your freedom, and I can't do that, Beatrice. I won't trap you here out of guilt or obligation. You've been trapped enough already." It was the first time he'd used her given name since that initial conversation in the study. The intimacy of it made something flutter in Beatrice's chest. "Arthur," she said softly, using his name deliberately. "Look at me." He didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned. The expression on his face made Beatrice's breath catch. Pain, conflict, and something else she couldn't quite name. Something that looked almost like, no, she was imagining things. "Nicholas knows I'm leaving," Beatrice said carefully. "I've been completely honest with him about that. And yes, it will hurt when I go. But Arthur, wouldn't it hurt more if I'd lied? If I'd promised forever and then broken that promise like everyone else?" "I know that logically," Arthur said. "But logic doesn't help when I watch my son come back to life and realize it's because of someone who won't be here to see him grow up. Beatrice stood, moving toward him before she could stop herself. Not close enough to touch, that would be inappropriate, but close enough to speak quietly. 6 months is a long time, Arthur. Many things can change in 6 months. Plans can shift. Circumstances can evolve. She paused, then added even more softly, people can change their minds. Arthur's gaze sharpened. Are you saying you might stay? I'm saying I don't know what I'll want in 6 months, Beatrice said honestly. I'm saying that when I made those plans for America, I'd never met Nicholas. She caught herself. I'd never worked with someone who trusted me the way you do. This place, this household, it's becoming something I didn't expect. Which is, Beatrice swallowed, it's becoming somewhere I could imagine belonging. The words hung between them, fragile and weighted with possibility. Arthur's hand twitched, as though he wanted to reach for her, but he kept it firmly at his side. Miss Langford, he said, his formality a stark contrast to the emotion in his eyes. I need to be very clear about something. Yes, Your Grace? I care about what happens to you, about your well-being, your happiness, your future, not just as your employer, but as— He stopped, visibly struggling. As someone who has come to value you greatly in a very short time. Beatrice's heart was hammering. Arthur, but, he continued firmly, I won't allow myself to develop feelings that would compromise your freedom to choose your own path. You came here fleeing one cage. I won't build you another, no matter how gilded it might be. He took a deliberate step backward, putting distance between them. So I need you to understand, Arthur said, his voice strained. Whatever you decide in 6 months, it must be your decision, not made out of guilt over Nicholas, not made out of some misplaced sense of obligation to me. Your decision, made freely. Beatrice wanted to argue, wanted to ask what he would want if obligation weren't a factor, wanted to know if the thing she saw in his eyes was what she hoped it was. But before she could find the words, Arthur had turned back to his desk. We should return to work, he said, his tone forcibly neutral. I believe you were documenting the embezzlement from 1821. The moment was over. The wall was back up, and Beatrice was left standing there, trying to understand what had just happened and why her chest ached, with something that felt uncomfortably like loss. By the second week, Beatrice had begun to notice a pattern. Mornings with Nicholas continued to improve. He'd started seeking her out, not obviously, but in small ways. A book left on her chair with a note about which chapter to read. A drawing slipped under her door, showing a Roman legion formation they'd discussed. Once, she found him waiting in the corridor outside her room at precisely 8:55, clearly having timed his arrival to seem accidental. Oh, he'd said with studied casualness. You're going to the library now. I was just heading that direction myself. They'd walked together in companionable silence, and Beatrice had hidden her smile. But afternoons in the study had become complicated. Arthur was always polite, always professional, always scrupulously proper, and always distant. He no longer looked at her the way he had that first week. No more lingering glances when he thought she wasn't paying attention. No more moments where their hands accidentally brushed, reaching for the same ledger. He'd positioned his desk further from hers, ostensibly to give her more workspace, but Beatrice knew better. When they spoke, it was about accounts or estate business. Nothing personal. Nothing beyond the bounds of employer and employee. The warmth from that first conversation, when he'd asked her to call him Arthur, when he'd spoken about Caroline's promises, when he'd said he valued her, had vanished behind a wall of careful formality. It hurt, more than Beatrice wanted to admit, more than it should, given that she barely knew him, but it hurt nonetheless. On Tuesday afternoon, Beatrice finally reached her breaking point. She'd been working for 3 hours in near-complete silence. Arthur had spoken exactly 4 times, all brief questions about account classifications. The tension in the study was thick enough to cut. Beatrice set down her pen with more force than necessary. Have I done something to offend you, Your Grace? Arthur looked up from his correspondence, expression carefully neutral. Of course not. Why would you ask that? Because you can barely stand to look at me anymore, Beatrice said bluntly. Because you've moved your desk further away. Because you speak to me now with less warmth than you show the footman. I'm merely maintaining appropriate professional distance. Appropriate professional distance, Beatrice repeated. Is that what we're calling it? Arthur's jaw tightened. Miss Langford, you asked me to call you Arthur, Beatrice interrupted. Just when we were alone, in this very room, you said you wanted— She stopped herself, realizing how close she was to saying something she couldn't take back. "I said many things that were inappropriate," Arthur said stiffly. "I've since reconsidered." "Reconsidered what, exactly?" "The wisdom of allowing our working relationship to become complicated by personal considerations." Beatrice felt something hot and sharp twist in her chest. "I see. So that conversation about me belonging here, about you valuing me greatly, was a mistake," Arthur said flatly. "A moment of weakness I deeply regret." The words hit like a slap. Beatrice stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "A mistake? Yes, I see." Beatrice's voice came out colder than she'd intended. "Thank you for clarifying, Your Grace. I'll be certain to maintain appropriate professional distance from now on. Wouldn't want any more mistakes." She gathered her papers with shaking hands. "Where are you going?" Arthur asked. "We have another hour of work scheduled." "I find I need some air, Your Grace. I'm sure you can manage without me for the rest of the afternoon." Beatrice left the study before he could respond, before the burning behind her eyes could turn into actual tears. She made it to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her bed with her head in her hands. Stupid, she told herself viciously. Stupid to think he meant any of it. Stupid to hope. Stupid to care. He was a duke. She was a temporary employee fleeing a scandal. Of course it had been a mistake. Of course he'd reconsidered. What had she expected? That he'd actually... A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Miss Langford," Mrs. Dawson's voice. "May I come in, dear?" Beatrice quickly wiped her eyes and stood. "Of course, ma'am." The housekeeper entered, took one look at Beatrice's face, and sighed. "Ah," she said, "I wondered when this would happen." "When what would happen, ma'am?" Mrs. Dawson closed the door and guided Beatrice back to sit on the bed. "When His Grace's fear would override his better judgment." Beatrice blinked. "I don't understand." "Don't you?" Mrs. Dawson sat beside her. "My dear girl, I've worked in this household for 20 years. I've seen His Grace through courtship, marriage, devastating loss, and 7 years of grief. I know the signs." "Signs of what?" "Of a man falling in love and being absolutely terrified by it." Beatrice's breath caught. "Mrs. Dawson, that's not..." "He said it was a mistake, that he regrets being vulnerable," Mrs. Dawson corrected gently. "There's a significant difference. His Grace hasn't allowed himself to care about anyone except Nicholas in 7 years. The moment he realizes he's developing feelings, he panics and retreats. It's not about you, dear. It's about him being too frightened to hope again." "That's..." Beatrice struggled to find words. "That doesn't make it hurt less." "No," Mrs. Dawson agreed. "I don't imagine it does." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Beatrice asked quietly, "You mentioned Caroline made him promise something, that it wasn't your story to tell." Mrs. Dawson was quiet for so long that Beatrice thought she wouldn't answer. Then, the late Duchess was dying. She knew it. And she made His Grace swear 3 things. The housekeeper's voice was soft with old grief. "I don't know all the details. That's between him and her memory. But I know one of those promises involved not letting grief turn him cold, not shutting himself away from the world." "He told me that," Beatrice said, "that he helped me because of a promise to his wife. Aye, but there was more to it than that." Mrs. Dawson looked at Beatrice directly. "She made him promise to live again, to love again, to not spend the rest of his life as a ghost haunting his own home." Beatrice's throat tightened. "But he can't." "Can he? Can't or won't?" Mrs. Dawson stood, smoothing her apron. "That's the question, isn't it? The late Duchess gave him permission to move forward. More than permission. She made him promise. But giving yourself permission to be happy after loss, that's much harder than any deathbed vow." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Give him time, dear. He's fighting 7 years of guilt and grief. That's not a battle won in a fortnight, no matter how strongly he might feel." "And if he never wins it?" Beatrice asked. "If he decides staying trapped in the past is safer than risking the future?" Mrs. Dawson's smile was sad. "Then you'll know, won't you? And you can make your choice accordingly, but don't give up on him just yet. Sometimes the people most worth loving are the ones who've forgotten how to let themselves be loved." The next few days were excruciating. Arthur maintained his careful distance. Polite, professional, utterly impersonal. Beatrice matched his formality, maintaining her own walls. They worked in silence, broken only by necessary questions about accounts. The easy warmth that had been building between them was gone, replaced by cold courtesy. Nicholas noticed. Of course he noticed. The boy missed nothing. "Did you and father have a disagreement?" he asked one morning in the library. his tone carefully casual. "Why would you think that?" Beatrice asked, trying to keep her voice light. "Because he's been different since Tuesday." Nicholas looked up from his book, quieter, "and he watches you at dinner the way he used to watch Mother's portrait. Like something hurts, but he doesn't want anyone to know." Beatrice's chest ached. "Sometimes adults are complicated, Nicholas. We don't always know how to say what we mean." "That's stupid." "It is, rather," Beatrice agreed. "But it's also human." Nicholas was quiet for a moment, then asked with the directness only children possess, "Do you like my father, Miss Langford?" Beatrice's breath caught. "That's not an appropriate question, Nicholas. You said you'd always answer my questions honestly." "I said I'd answer appropriate questions honestly. But this is important." Nicholas's eyes were too knowing. "Because if you like him, and he likes you, but you're both too stupid to say so, then you're going to waste all the time before you leave being miserable instead of happy. And that seems like a terrible waste." "Out of the mouths of children." "It's more complicated than that," Beatrice said softly. "Adults always say that, but usually it's not. Usually it's just two people being too scared to be honest." Nicholas returned to his book, apparently done with the conversation, but Beatrice sat there, his words echoing in her mind. Two people being too scared to be honest. Was that what they were? That evening, Beatrice made a decision. She would give Arthur his space, would maintain the professional distance he clearly needed, but she wouldn't leave without understanding why. In 6 months, when her time at Silverton Manor ended, she would ask him directly, would demand honesty the way she'd promised Nicholas. And then she would make her choice about America knowing the full truth. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't what she wanted, but it was the best she could do with a man who was fighting ghosts she couldn't see and promises she didn't fully understand. So Beatrice threw herself into the work. By the end of the 2nd week, she'd completed a comprehensive audit of the household accounts. The embezzlement totaled $2,847 over 6 years. She documented every instance, prepared a full report, and organized the evidence for Arthur's solicitor. She'd also begun training one of the senior footmen, a young man named Thomas with a head for figures, in basic bookkeeping. If Arthur wanted to hire a proper steward, Thomas could assist until someone was found. She was making herself unnecessary, creating a path for her own exit, and if that thought made her chest ache, well, that was her problem to manage. Friday evening, Arthur requested her presence in the study after dinner. Beatrice knocked and entered to find him standing by the fireplace, her completed audit report in his hands. "You finished?" he said. "Yes, Your Grace. This is..." He flipped through the pages. "Extraordinary work, Miss Langford. Comprehensive, clearly documented, organized for legal review. My solicitor in London couldn't have done better. Thank you, Your Grace. You've also begun training Thomas. I thought it prudent to ensure continuity, Your Grace. When I leave..." Something flickered in Arthur's eyes. "When you leave, yes." Silence fell. Arthur set the report on his desk and turned to face her fully. "Miss Langford, I owe you an apology." Beatrice's heart stuttered. "Your Grace, I've been..." Arthur searched for words. "Unfair to you these past days. Cold, distant. You deserve better than that. You've been perfectly professional, Your Grace." "Professional," Arthur repeated with a bitter laugh. "Yes, I've been extremely professional. And in being so, I've hurt you, I can see it, even if you're too well-mannered to say so." Beatrice said nothing. What could she say? Arthur moved closer, though he maintained careful distance. "I told you before that I valued you. That was true. It remains true." He paused. "But Miss Langford, Beatrice, I need you to understand something." "What, Your Grace?" "I'm not..." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I'm not a man who can afford to develop feelings for someone who's leaving. I lost someone I loved more than life itself. Watching her die, knowing I chose to let her die to save our child, has broken something in me that I don't know how to fix." His voice roughened with emotion. "And when I feel myself starting to care for you, and I do, God help me, I do care. It terrifies me. Because in 6 months you'll leave, and I'll lose someone else I've allowed myself to care about, and I don't know if I can survive that again." Beatrice's throat was tight. "So you push me away first." "So I maintain distance," Arthur corrected, "to protect us both, because if I let myself fall in love with you, Beatrice, I won't be able to let you go when the time comes. And keeping you here against your will, even with the best intentions, would be unconscionable." "You keep talking about my will as though you know what it is," Beatrice said quietly. "As though you've asked me what I want." Arthur's eyes met hers. "What do you want?" The question hung between them. Beatrice could answer honestly, could tell him that she was already half in love with him and his broken household and his wounded son. Could admit that the thought of leaving in 6 months hurt more than the thought of staying, but looking at the pain in Arthur's eyes, the fear barely masked behind careful control, she understood. He wasn't ready. He might never be ready. And she couldn't force him to be. "I want," Beatrice said carefully, "to honor my commitment. 6 months of work in exchange for passage to America. That was our agreement. And if I asked you to stay? Are you asking?" Arthur held her gaze for a long, painful moment. Then he looked away. "No, I'm not." And there it was. The truth, finally spoken. He cared for her, perhaps could even love her, given time, but he was too afraid to try. "Then I suppose we both know where we stand, Your Grace," Beatrice said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I'll continue working with Nicholas in the mornings and completing whatever additional tasks you require. In 6 months, I'll leave for Boston as planned, and we'll both move forward with our separate lives." "Beatrice, is there anything else you needed to discuss, Your Grace?" Arthur's hands clenched at his sides. "No, nothing else." "Then, if you'll excuse me, I have correspondence to write." Beatrice turned and walked to the door. Beatrice." She paused but didn't turn around. "Yes, Your Grace. I'm sorry. For all of this, you deserve better." "Yes," Beatrice said quietly. "I do." She left the study with her head high and her heart breaking, and behind her, Arthur stood alone in the firelight, surrounded by perfectly organized ledgers that documented theft and loss and the price of misplaced trust. Outside the study door, Beatrice leaned against the wall and pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. 6 months suddenly felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. Long enough to fall completely in love with a man who was too broken to love her back. Short enough that she'd have to leave just when it would hurt the most. Perhaps, she thought, I should start looking into earlier passage to Boston. But even as the thought formed, she knew she wouldn't. She'd made a promise to Nicholas. She'd committed to 6 months of work. And unlike every other adult in that boy's life, she would keep her promises, even if it destroyed her in the process. 6 weeks had passed since Beatrice arrived at Silverton Manor, 6 weeks of mornings with Nicholas and afternoons avoiding Arthur's eyes, 6 weeks of pretending her heart wasn't breaking a little more each day. Mornings with Nicholas continued to improve. He'd begun arriving early to their sessions, books already selected, questions prepared. He challenged her interpretations of military campaigns, debated strategy, and once, only once, called her B, before quickly correcting himself back to Miss Langford. Beatrice pretended not to notice the slip, but she'd smiled about it for the rest of the day. Afternoons in the study had become an exercise in controlled avoidance. Arthur was always polite, always professional, always achingly distant. They worked in silence, punctuated only by necessary questions about accounts or estate business. She'd completed the full audit weeks ago and had moved on to training Thomas, the young footman with a talent for figures. Her work at Silverton Manor was essentially finished. She could leave whenever she chose. But she didn't. She told herself it was because Nicholas needed consistency, because Arthur's accounts still required oversight, because Mrs. Dawson had asked her to stay through the quarter end. All true. All excuses. The real reason sat across from her every afternoon, carefully not looking at her, pretending he couldn't feel the tension that crackled between them, like lightning waiting to strike. It was mid-June when everything finally shattered. Beatrice was in the library with Nicholas, discussing the siege of Constantinople, when Arthur appeared in the doorway. "Nicholas," he said, "Mr. Pemberton has arrived for your lessons." Nicholas looked up, clearly torn between duty and the far more interesting conversation he was having about Byzantine fortifications. "Can't I skip today?" he asked. "Miss Langford was just explaining how the chain across the Golden Horn—" "Your lessons are important," Arthur interrupted, though his tone was gentle. "Miss Langford will still be here this afternoon." Nicholas sighed dramatically but gathered his books. As he passed his father, he muttered, "You're being stupid, you know." Arthur blinked. "I beg your pardon." But Nicholas had already gone, leaving his words hanging in the air. Beatrice stood, intending to excuse herself as well, but Arthur's voice stopped her. "Miss Langford, a word, if you please." It was the first time he'd requested private conversation in weeks. Beatrice's pulse quickened despite her best efforts. "Of course, Your Grace." Arthur closed the library door, propriety be damned, apparently, and turned to face her. "What did Nicholas mean by that?" he asked. I'm sure I don't know, Your Grace. Don't. Arthur's voice was sharp. Don't pretend you don't understand. You're far too intelligent for that, and we both know it. Beatrice lifted her chin. If you have something to ask me, Your Grace, then ask it directly. Fine. Arthur took a step closer. Has Nicholas said something to you? About us? There is no us, Your Grace. You've made that abundantly clear. The words came out more bitter than Beatrice had intended. Arthur flinched as though she'd struck him. Beatrice, Miss Langford, she corrected coldly. You've been quite insistent on formality these past weeks. Let's maintain it, shall we? That's not fair. Fair. Beatrice felt weeks of suppressed frustration finally boiling over. You want to discuss what's fair, Your Grace? Very well. Let's discuss how you thanked me that night on the stairs. How you looked at me as though... She stopped herself. And then, the next morning, you could barely stand to be in the same room with me. I was trying to maintain appropriate boundaries. You were running away, Beatrice shot back. From what, I still don't understand. But you've been running for weeks, Your Grace, and I'm tired of pretending I don't notice. Arthur's jaw tightened. If you don't understand the situation, then explain it to me. You said yourself I'm intelligent, so explain why you look at me sometimes like I'm the answer to a question you're afraid to ask, and then spend the next 3 days treating me like a particularly problematic ledger that needs to be filed away and forgotten. Because... Arthur stopped, turned away from her, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Beatrice waited. The silence stretched. Finally, she said quietly, Nicholas asked me something last week. Arthur turned back. What? He asked if I was planning to leave early, before the 6 months were complete. Beatrice met Arthur's gaze steadily. He said you'd been looking at ship schedules in your study, that you'd made inquiries about passages to Boston. Arthur went very still. Were you? Beatrice asked. I planning to send me away. I was planning to give you the option, Arthur said, his voice strained, to leave sooner if you wished, to escape this impossible situation I've created. What impossible situation? This one, Arthur gestured between them, where every day I work across from you and want things I have no right to want, where I watch you with my son and imagine futures that can never exist, where I... He stopped himself again. Where you what? Beatrice pressed. Arthur's control finally shattered. Where I fall more in love with you every damn day and know that in a matter of weeks you'll leave for America and I'll lose you just like I've lost everyone else I've ever cared about. The words echoed in the library. Beatrice couldn't breathe. You... She struggled to form words. You're in love with me? Arthur laughed, a harsh sound without humor. How could I not be? You're brilliant, brave, honest to a fault. You brought my son back to life. You organized chaos I couldn't manage. You look at me like I'm just a man, not a duke or a title or a convenient solution to your problems. He moved closer, and Beatrice could see the raw emotion in his eyes. But I won't ask you to stay, because keeping you here out of guilt or obligation would make me no better than your stepmother. You deserve freedom, Beatrice. You deserve choice. Even if that choice means leaving me behind. Beatrice's throat was tight. You're an idiot. Arthur blinked. I beg your pardon. An idiot, Beatrice repeated. You've spent weeks pushing me away, making me miserable, making yourself miserable, because you were trying to protect my freedom to choose. Yes, without ever once asking what I would choose if given the option. Arthur opened his mouth, closed it. You assumed, Beatrice said, taking a step toward him, that I would choose America, choose my aunt, choose anything except staying here with a man too afraid to tell me how he felt. Beatrice, I have been half in love with you since you opened that carriage door, Beatrice said, her voice shaking, fully in love since you trusted me with your accounts and your son and your grief, and utterly miserable for weeks thinking you regretted ever bringing me here. You love me. Yes, you impossible man, I love you. Arthur stared at her as though she'd spoken in a foreign language. Then, slowly, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands with devastating gentleness. Say it again, he whispered. I love you. Again. I love you, Arthur Silverton. And if you don't kiss me right now, I'm going to... He kissed her, not gently, not tentatively. He kissed her with weeks of suppressed longing and fear and desperate hope, and Beatrice kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Arthur rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you, he said. Probably not, Beatrice agreed. But you're stuck with me anyway. Beatrice. Arthur pulled back enough to look at her properly. I need to explain something. About Caroline. About the promises I made. Mrs. Dawson mentioned... She told you. Arthur looked surprised. Only that Caroline made you promise 3 things. That one involved not letting grief make you cold. Beatrice hesitated. What were the others? Arthur took her hand and led her to sit on the library sofa. He didn't let go of her hand. Caroline knew she was dying, he said quietly. The bleeding wouldn't stop. The physicians had given up. And in those last hours, she made me swear 3 things. He looked down at their joined hands. First, that I would be a present father to Nicholas, that I wouldn't let grief make me abandon him emotionally, the way my own father abandoned me after my mother died. His voice roughened. I failed that promise, spectacularly. For 3 years, I was exactly the absent father she'd begged me not to become. You're present now, Beatrice said gently. Because of you, Arthur said, which brings me to the second promise. She made me swear I wouldn't let the pain make me cold, that I would continue to see people who needed help, that I would keep my heart open to the world even when it hurt. That's why you helped me. Yes, though by the time I met you, I'd already started breaking that promise too. I'd been closed off for years, going through the motions of duty without any real engagement. Arthur looked at her. You changed that. And the third promise? Beatrice asked softly. Arthur's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. She made me promise that I would love again, that I would remarry, that I wouldn't spend the rest of my life as a ghost haunting my own home. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She said Nicholas deserved a whole family, not a broken father trapped in the past. And she made me swear, actually swear on our son's life, that I would keep living even after she was gone. Tears pricked Beatrice's eyes. Oh, Arthur, for 7 years, I couldn't imagine fulfilling that promise. The guilt was too heavy, the grief too consuming, and honestly, he looked at her with raw honesty. I didn't want to, because keeping that promise meant admitting she was truly gone, meant letting go. And I wasn't ready. Until a desperate woman knocked on my carriage window in the rain and reminded me what it felt like to want to help someone, to care whether they lived or died. Arthur lifted her hand to his lips. Until I watched that same woman win over my son with nothing but honesty and patience. Until I sat across from her every afternoon and remembered what it felt like to want. You were terrified, Beatrice said, remembering that night on the stairs. Utterly terrified, Arthur confirmed. Because falling in love with you meant finally keeping the third promise, meant truly letting Caroline go. And it felt like betrayal even though I knew it was exactly what she'd asked me to do. Is that why you pulled away? I pulled away because I was a coward, Arthur said bluntly. Because loving you meant facing 7 years of guilt and grief and somehow finding the courage to choose happiness anyway. And I didn't know if I could do it. And now, Arthur brought both hands up to frame her face again, looking at her with such open emotion that Beatrice's breath caught. Now I realize that staying trapped in the past isn't honoring Caroline's memory. It's betraying it. She didn't ask me to grieve forever. She asked me to live, to love, to be the kind of man who could open doors for desperate strangers and fall in love with brilliant women who organize his accounts and steal his son's heart. He smiled, and it transformed his whole face. So no more pulling away, no more running. I love you, Beatrice Langford, and I'm choosing you, not out of obligation to a promise, but because you're the only choice I want to make. Beatrice was crying now, tears streaming freely down her face. I choose you too. America can wait. Or, she paused, or maybe America was never really what I wanted. Maybe I just needed somewhere to belong, and I've found that here. Stay, Arthur said, not as my employee, not as Nicholas's tutor. Stay as my wife, as his mother, as the woman I love more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. Yes, Beatrice said without hesitation. Yes, yes, yes. They kissed again, slower this time, sweeter, with the desperate edge giving way to certainty and joy, and the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine. When they finally pulled apart, Arthur was smiling. Nicholas is going to be insufferable about this, he said. He's been telling me for weeks that I was being stupid. He's a perceptive child. He gets that from his mother, Arthur said. Then, more quietly, both of them. The words hung in the air, an acknowledgement of Caroline's place in their story and Beatrice's new place in their future. Thank you, Beatrice whispered. For what? For opening that carriage door, for trusting me with your accounts and your son and your grief, for being brave enough to love again even when it terrified you. Arthur pulled her close, tucking her against his chest. Thank you for knocking, for staying, for being patient with a man too stubborn and broken to see what was right in front of him. They sat there for a long moment, wrapped in each other and the quiet peace of finally getting it right. Then Beatrice pulled back slightly. Arthur? Yes? We should probably tell Nicholas before he hears it from the servants. Arthur laughed. He's going to claim he knew all along. He probably did. Insufferable child. Our insufferable child, Beatrice corrected. Arthur's eyes softened. Our child. I like the sound of that. So do I. They stood, hands still joined, and headed toward the door. Tomorrow there would be logistics to manage, calling the bands, writing to her aunt in Boston, dealing with the inevitable gossip. But today they had each other, and that was more than enough. They found Nicholas in the schoolroom with Mr. Pemberton, supposedly working on Latin conjugations, but actually doodling what appeared to be siege engines in the margins of his workbook. Nicholas, Arthur said from the doorway, a word, please. Mr. Pemberton looked up, clearly prepared to defend his student, but Arthur waved him off. It's a family matter. We'll return him shortly. Nicholas set down his pen with barely concealed relief and followed them into the corridor. His eyes darted between Arthur and Beatrice, taking in their joined hands, their barely suppressed smiles. Finally, he said. Arthur blinked. Finally, you told her you love her. It wasn't a question. How did you... You've been miserable for weeks, father. Both of you. It was obvious. Nicholas crossed his thin arms. I told you that you were being stupid. Yes, well, Arthur cleared his throat. You were correct. I was being stupid, but I've remedied that situation. Good. Nicholas looked at Beatrice. Does this mean you're staying, not going to America? I'm staying, Beatrice confirmed, as my actual mother, not just as a tutor pretending to be something else. Beatrice's throat tightened. If you'll have me, yes. As your actual mother. Nicholas studied her for a long moment, with a wary gaze that had seen far too much for a child his age. Then, so quietly, Beatrice almost missed it. I'd like that. It wasn't an enthusiastic declaration, wasn't a dramatic embrace. But for Nicholas, it was everything. Beatrice knelt down to his level. I know I can never replace your first mother, Nicholas. I wouldn't want to try. But I promise you this. I will be here. I will stay. And I will love you for as long as you'll let me. Even when I'm difficult, especially when you're difficult. Nicholas's lips twitched. I'm difficult quite often. I've noticed, Beatrice said gravely. I'm prepared to handle it. And you won't leave, even if I'm horrible and drive you away like I did the governesses. Those women left because they didn't truly see you, Nicholas. I see you. The brilliant, brave, wounded boy who's been protecting himself the only way he knows how, and I'm not going anywhere. Nicholas looked at his father. You promise too. Arthur knelt beside Beatrice. I promise, son. Miss Langford, Beatrice, is going to be part of our family, permanently. If she'll agree to marry me properly. I already agreed, Beatrice said. You agreed in the library in the heat of the moment, Arthur said with a small smile. I'd like to do it properly, with my son present. He took Beatrice's hand and looked at her with such open affection that her heart stuttered. Beatrice Langford, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of being mother to my son, of spending the rest of your life helping me be the man I should have been all along? Yes, Beatrice said, tears streaming freely now. Yes, Arthur. To all of it? Nicholas made a sound that might have been approval or might have been exasperation. Are you going to kiss her again? Because if so, I should probably look away. Arthur laughed, a real, full laugh that Beatrice had never heard from him before. Yes, I'm going to kiss her. You should definitely look away. Disgusting, Nicholas muttered, but he was smiling as he turned his back. Arthur kissed her gently, properly, with his son standing 3 feet away pretending not to peek. When they broke apart, Nicholas said, without turning around, Are you finished? For now, Arthur confirmed. Nicholas turned back, and his expression had shifted to something more serious. Miss Beatrice, I have a question. Of course. What should I call you? After you're married to father. I don't think Miss Langford works anymore. But mother feels... He struggled with the word. Strange. I had a mother. She died. Beatrice's heart ached for him. What would feel right to you? Nicholas considered. Could I just call you B, like I did that one time by accident? I'd like that very much. And maybe... Nicholas looked down at his feet. Maybe someday, if it feels right. I could call you mother too, or mama, but not yet. Is that acceptable? That's more than acceptable, Beatrice said gently. You call me whatever feels comfortable, Nicholas. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Nicholas nodded, clearly relieved. Then, with typical 7-year-old pragmatism, when's the wedding? Will there be cake? Arthur and Beatrice looked at each other and burst out laughing. As Beatrice prepared for bed that night, Mrs. Dawson helped her out of the borrowed dress. I'm glad, the housekeeper said quietly. The late Duchess would be glad too. She'd say you've given His Grace back something she couldn't, a reason to keep that third promise. Beatrice's throat tightened. I hope I can live up to it. You already have a dear, Mrs. Dawson smiled. You already have. The next weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Arthur called the banns at the parish church. Beatrice wrote to her aunt in Boston explaining the change in plans. Mrs. Dawson threw herself into wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that suggested she'd been waiting years for exactly this outcome. The household staff, who'd apparently been speculating about Arthur and Beatrice's relationship for weeks, received the news with barely concealed satisfaction. The cook immediately began planning an elaborate wedding breakfast. The maids competed over who would help Beatrice dress on the wedding day. Even the solicitor who'd been handling Arthur's embezzlement case sent congratulations along with the news that Mr. Pemberton's estate had been located and partial restitution would be possible. Everything was falling into place, except for one thing. 3 days before the wedding, Beatrice woke in the middle of the night with her heart racing and panic clawing at her throat. She was actually doing this, marrying a duke, becoming a duchess, taking on responsibility for a wounded child and a vast estate, and a future she'd never imagined possible just months ago. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she failed? What if... A soft knock at her door interrupted the spiral of anxiety. Beatrice, Arthur's voice, quiet and concerned. I saw your light. Are you all right? She opened the door to find him in shirt sleeves and trousers, hair disheveled, clearly having dressed hastily. I couldn't sleep, she admitted. Neither could I, it seems. Arthur's eyes searched her face. What's wrong? I'm terrified, Beatrice said honestly. What if I can't do this? What if I'm not suited to be a duchess? What if I disappoint you, or Nicholas, or... Arthur stepped into the room, might propriety be damned at this point, and pulled her into his arms. Do you remember what you told Nicholas? He asked. As when he asked if you'd leave when he was difficult. That I see him. That I'm not going anywhere. I see you too, Beatrice. The brilliant woman who escaped an asylum commitment and organized my chaotic accounts. The brave woman who won over my son with nothing but honesty and patience. The extraordinary woman who somehow found it in her heart to love a broken duke who'd forgotten how to live. He pulled back enough to look at her. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know everything about being a duchess. You just have to be yourself. That's all I've ever wanted. That's all I'll ever need. And if I make mistakes, then we'll fix them together. Arthur smiled. I'm rather good at fixing mistakes. I've had considerable practice lately. Beatrice laughed despite her tears. I love you. I love you too. Now please go back to sleep before Mrs. Dawson discovers I'm in your room 3 days before the wedding and has an apoplexy about propriety. Too late for propriety, I think. Probably, Arthur agreed. But let's not give her a heart condition anyway. He kissed her forehead and left, and Beatrice climbed back into bed feeling considerably calmer. She was going to marry Arthur Silverton. She was going to be Nicholas's mother. She was going to be a duchess, and somehow, impossibly, it was going to be all right. 2 weeks before the wedding, Arthur's solicitor arrived from London with news. Lady Cordelia has been located, he said, spreading documents across Arthur's desk. She's attempting to contest your guardianship of Miss Langford on grounds that... Miss Langford is of age, Arthur interrupted calmly. 24 years old. She requires no guardian. Precisely what I informed Lady Cordelia's solicitor. The man smiled grimly. Additionally, evidence of the forged will has been presented to the proper authorities. Lady Cordelia is currently under investigation for fraud. Beatrice, who'd been listening from her usual chair, felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. It's over, she asked quietly. Not entirely, the solicitor admitted. Legal proceedings will take time, but your Grace's protection, he nodded to Arthur, makes you effectively untouchable. Lady Cordelia has no legal standing to pursue you. After the solicitor left, Arthur found Beatrice standing at the window, staring out at the gardens. You're safe, he said quietly. coming to stand behind her. "She can't hurt you anymore." "I know." Beatrice leaned back against him. "It's strange. I spent months terrified of her finding me. And now I realize she already lost. The moment you opened that carriage door, she lost." Beatrice turned to face him. "Because I found something she can never take away." "What's that?" "Home." The wedding was small, just family, what remained of it, and close household staff. Mrs. Dawson wept openly throughout the entire ceremony. Nicholas stood as Arthur's witness, looking simultaneously proud and slightly uncomfortable in his formal attire. Beatrice wore a gown of pale blue silk that had been Caroline's and altered to fit her. Mrs. Dawson had suggested it tentatively, afraid Beatrice might find it inappropriate, but Beatrice had accepted gladly. It felt right, somehow, to wear something of Caroline's. A reminder that she wasn't replacing Nicholas's first mother, but continuing a legacy of love that Caroline had started. When Arthur saw her walking down the short aisle of the Manor's chapel, his eyes filled with tears. "You're beautiful," he whispered when she reached him. "I'm terrified," she whispered back. "So am I. We'll be terrified together." The ceremony was brief, traditional. The vicar spoke of love and commitment and partnership, and when Arthur slipped the ring onto Beatrice's finger and promised to love her for the rest of his life, she believed him. When she made the same promise in return, she meant every word. "You may kiss your bride," the vicar said with a smile. Arthur did, thoroughly, while Nicholas made exaggerated gagging sounds and Mrs. Dawson wept even harder. And just like that, Beatrice Langford became Beatrice Silverton, Duchess of Silverton. 2 years later, Beatrice stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching Arthur read to their daughter. Eleanor was 6 months old, all dark curls and her father's amber eyes. She babbled contentedly as Arthur showed her the pictures in a book about Roman military campaigns. "I'm not certain she's quite ready for siege warfare," Beatrice said with amusement. Arthur looked up and grinned. "Turk, it's never too early to learn proper military strategy. She can't even sit up on her own yet." Minor detail. Nicholas appeared behind Beatrice, now 9 years old and considerably less thin than he'd been 2 years ago. "Is father boring Eleanor with history again?" "Apparently," Beatrice said. "Poor Eleanor," Nicholas said with exaggerated sympathy. Then, more quietly, "Mama, do you have a moment? I need help with something." Beatrice's heart still fluttered every time Nicholas called her that. He'd started using Mama about 6 months ago, casually, as though it had always been her name. "Of course. What do you need?" "I'm writing a letter to grandmother." He meant Beatrice's aunt in Boston, who'd finally visited last summer and promptly declared Nicholas her favorite grandchild, despite not being biologically related. "So, but I'm not certain how to spell Constantinople." "Let's work on it together," Beatrice said. As they headed toward Nicholas's room, Arthur called after them, "Don't forget, the solicitor is coming this afternoon about the new steward candidates." "I remember," Beatrice called back. "Thomas is preparing the accounts for review." Thomas had proven to be an excellent assistant, and Arthur was finally ready to hire a proper steward. Beatrice would oversee the transition, but her primary role now was as Duchess and mother, not accountant, though she still reviewed the books quarterly. Old habits died hard. Later that afternoon, after the solicitor had left and Eleanor had been put down for her nap, Beatrice found Arthur in his study. He looked up as she entered, and his face transformed with the smile he reserved just for her. "Hello, wife." "Hello, husband." Beatrice moved around the desk and settled onto his lap, a habit they'd developed during those first married months and never quite broken. Arthur wrapped his arms around her waist. "Happy? Ridiculously so. You? Beyond measure." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Do you ever regret it? Not going to America? Not having the adventure you'd planned?" Beatrice thought about it honestly. "No, I found a better adventure here. A family, a home, a purpose. Everything I was running toward in Boston I found at Silverton Manor. Because I opened a carriage door in the rain. Because you were brave enough to keep a promise to someone you loved. And because I was desperate enough to ask for help." Beatrice turned to look at him properly. "We both had to be brave that night. We both had to choose hope over fear. I'm glad we did. So am I." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Arthur said quietly, "I visited Caroline's grave yesterday, with Nicholas." Beatrice's heart squeezed. "How was he?" "Good. Peaceful. He told her about Eleanor, about you, about how happy we are." Arthur's voice thickened. "And he thanked her for making me promise to keep living. He said he used to be angry about it, but now he understands why she did it. Tears pricked Beatrice's eyes. "That's beautiful. I thanked her too," Arthur continued, "for giving me permission to love again, for pushing me toward a future I couldn't imagine at the time." He looked at Beatrice. "I think she'd like you. I think she'd be glad I found you." "I hope so," Beatrice said softly. "I like to think she'd be happy knowing Nicholas has a whole family now." "That you both do." Arthur pulled her closer. "We have more than a family. We have happiness, peace, a future full of possibility." He smiled. "And apparently a daughter who's going to be a military strategist before she can walk." Beatrice laughed. "I blame you for that entirely. I accept full responsibility." They kissed, sweet and familiar, the kind of kiss that spoke of years together and years still to come. When they pulled apart, Beatrice said, "Nicholas wants to know if we can get a dog." "Absolutely not." "That's what I said." "Good." Pause. "Though a small dog might be acceptable," Arthur added. "For Eleanor, of course." "Of course," Beatrice agreed, hiding her smile. Nicholas was getting his dog. They both knew it. From down the hall came the sound of Eleanor waking from her nap, making the small cooing sounds that meant she wanted attention. "Your turn," Arthur said. "I got her last time. But you're so much better at it." "Flatterer. It's one of my best qualities." Beatrice stood and headed toward the door, then paused to look back at Arthur. He was watching her with such open love that her breath caught on even after 2 years of marriage. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Arthur replied. "Now go rescue our daughter from her crib before she decides to launch a siege on the nursery." Military humor. How romantic. "You married me anyway." "I did," Beatrice agreed. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Arthur corrected. "First was knocking on that carriage door." Beatrice smiled. "You're right. First was knocking. Second was staying. And third was realizing that home isn't a place. It's people who love you, even when you're difficult and broken and trying to figure out how to be brave." Arthur stood and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms one more time. "We figured it out though, didn't we?" he said. "How to be brave together." "We did," Beatrice agreed. "And we'll keep figuring it out, for the rest of our lives." "I'm looking forward to it." "So am I." Eleanor's coos turned into more insistent demands for attention. "You should probably," Arthur began. I'm going. But before she left, she kissed him once more, quick and sweet and full of promise. Then she went to get their daughter, while Arthur returned to his correspondence and Nicholas practiced his spelling. And somewhere in the gardens, Mrs. Dawson hummed while cutting flowers for the dinner table. It was ordinary, domestic, nothing like the desperate flight through London rain that had brought Beatrice here. It was perfect. And as Beatrice picked up Eleanor and the baby grasped her finger with a surprisingly strong grip, she thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. The choice to run, the choice to ask for help, the choice to stay when leaving would have been safer, the choice to love when fear would have been easier. She'd chosen bravely, and brave choices, she'd learned, led to the kind of happiness she'd never imagined possible. The kind that felt like coming home. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a like, sharing it with friends, and writing a comment below. Your support means everything to us and keeps us inspired to tell more stories filled with love, resilience, redemption, and second chances. At the end of this video, you'll find another unforgettable romance from our collection. Click and discover where the next story will take you. With all our appreciation, the Empire of Heart Stories team.